When you think of Russia, your thoughts most likely go to the major cities that are located on the western edge of the country, which is the region of the country that is geographically located in Europe. You may visualize the onion domes that are so famous in Moscow or the streets of St. Petersburg, which are so historically significant. That is correct, by the way. The majority of the population are located there, and the majority of the historical events that we read about took place there. On the other hand, the portion of Russia known as European Russia accounts for only roughly 23% of the overall area of the country. A vast, untamed, and frequently cruel swath of territory that extends all the way to the Pacific Ocean makes up the remaining 77% of the land of the United States. A region known as Siberia is located here. An understatement would be to suggest that Siberia is a landmass. The vastness of this globe, which is comprised of lush woods, towering mountain ranges, and icy tundra, is approximately 50 times larger than the entirety of the United Kingdom. Extremism is the word that best defines what is going on here. One of the most difficult obstacles to overcome is the weather. Over the course of a whole year, the average temperature across the entirety of Siberia is consistently rather close to freezing. Because it can reach temperatures that are unfathomable throughout the winter, it is considered to be one of the coldest spots on the globe where people live. Moreover, the weather is not the only thing that is attempting to take your life. Just as daunting is the wildlife that can be found in Siberia. The grizzly bears that are found in North America are of the same species as the enormous brown bears that you have. Gray wolves can be found in packs, and some of them can grow to reach almost 200 pounds in weight, making them dwarf any other wolves you could encounter in other places. And then there is the Siberian tiger, which is a predator that is both extremely intelligent and extremely powerful. One of the few creatures on Earth that has been documented to intentionally hunt humans, sometimes even for vengeance, these tigers are among the few that have been known to do so. There is a well-known tale that dates back to 1997 about a hunter who accidentally shot and injured a Siberian tiger. This tiger did not pass away. As an alternative, it followed the hunter all the way back to his cabin, waited for him to emerge from the building, and then proceeded to murder and consume him. As you might have guessed, the number of people who choose to reside in Siberia is relatively low. Given the enormous extent of the area, the population is extremely small. On the other hand, for a particular category of individuals, the very same traits that scare away the majority of people are the precise things that attract them. Siberia is one of the few truly wild areas on Earth, and it is a final frontier that needs to be experienced by those who are interested in taking on new challenges and traveling. Additionally, a young man from the United States by the name of Colin Madson was one of these daring individuals. Growing up in Missouri, Colin was a member of a family that was both prosperous and caring. Since he was a little boy, he had a deep fascination with the natural world. He enjoyed going on hikes, camping, and simply being outside in the greenery. When he was younger, he began reading about Siberia at some time in his life. After looking at photographs of its wild and unspoiled beauty, he became utterly enthralled by the place. What he was interested in was not merely a passing curiosity. In the depths of it, he dove. He started learning about the history of Russia and Siberia, and he even taught himself how to speak Russian well. It wasn't enough for him to simply travel to Siberia. He wanted to live there and completely submerge himself in the culture. Furthermore, in the year 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he was able to turn his desire into success. Irkutsk, which is located in the middle of the world, became his new home after he packed his belongings, said his goodbyes to his family in Missouri, and went there. Irkutsk is one of the few large population concentrations in the southeast region of Siberia, and it is situated directly on the shore of Lake Baikal. The natural wonder that is Lake Baikal is, in and of itself, it is the freshwater lake that is both the oldest and the deepest in the world. It is so deep and clear that in certain areas you can see more than 100 feet below the surface. The idea that Colin had for his new life in Siberia was straightforward but nonetheless grandiose. In order to further his education, he would enroll in a university, and in his leisure time, he would spend it exploring the wilderness that he had fantasized about for such a long time. Moreover, over a period of time, everything proceeded precisely in accordance with that plan. As soon as he was accepted into the local branch of Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, he was able to immediately form a group of friends who shared his enthusiasm for the great outdoors. It was a group of individuals who, just like him, were anxious to explore the immense wilderness that was Siberia. The life that Colin had always desired was the life that he had from the time he came in 2013 until the year 2016. Not only did he excel in his academic pursuits, but he also enthusiastically spent endless weekends and holidays going on hikes and camping in the mountains and forests that encircled Lake Baikal. In addition, he was not only a tourist who went hiking for fun. After gaining such a deep understanding of the area and becoming proficient in negotiating its difficult terrain, he decided to begin working for a local group that was dedicated to charitable causes. Their objective was to establish and label new hiking paths so that others might enjoy them in a secure environment. As a result, Colin was essentially venturing into undiscovered area, so paving the way for new routes through the Siberian wilderness. In a setting where there was very little room for error, he was a knowledgeable individual who was regarded for his abilities and his composed approach to surviving in the environment. Because of this, when his family received the news in 2016 about what had occurred to him, it was something that they simply were unable to comprehend. In the month of March, in the year 2016, Colin and 3 of his closest hiking companions came to the conclusion that it was time for new adventures. As well as being an American, one of the pals was also Russian, and the other 2 were American. In the same way as Colin was, all of them were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. Following the examination of maps, they settled on a destination, which turned out to be the peak of a mountain that was referred to as Love Peak. They were a few hours' drive away from their home base in Irkutsk, which was located in a little settlement named Arshan. Love Peak was located there. Now, when compared to other hikes in Siberia, this one was not particularly challenging at all. There were some steep sections on the trail that led up to the peak, but it was fairly well defined and had been walked quite a bit. Every single one of the 4 men, including Colin, had hiked it on multiple occasions in the past. It was a trip that was both familiar and reasonably risk-free. Being seasoned hikers in Siberia, however, meant that they were aware of one thing above all others: you should never show disrespect to the natural environment. Without proper preparation, even the most straightforward hike could turn out to be fatal. Anywhere could be a potential danger. As a result, they were very serious about their preparations. In order to rent a tiny rustic cabin at the foot of the mountain, the intention was to drive to Arshan and make the trip there. Using this cottage as their base camp would be their plan. Before beginning their ascent early the following morning, it would provide them with a location to get themselves organized, check their equipment, and get a full night's sleep the night before. Therefore, they made a reservation in advance for one of the cute tiny cabins that were tucked away in the woods and were located close to the trailhead. A few days later, on the morning of March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends began the journey to the village of Arshan by embarking on a westbound journey from Irkutsk. They packed their car with all of their equipment and supplies and began their journey. Upon their arrival, they made a brief detour at a nearby store to purchase some water and food for the last minute, and then they proceeded to make their way to the cabin that they had leased. Exactly as they had anticipated, it was a straightforward location. It was essentially a single room with a few beds, which was just enough to provide refuge from the chilly environmental conditions of Siberia. Inside, there was no plumbing available. In the event that you required the use of the restroom, there was a modest outhouse located a short distance away from the cabin. The 4 companions made themselves comfortable, claimed their mattresses, and immediately began arranging their belongings in preparation for the hike that would take place the next day. They continued to converse, eat, and simply take pleasure in each other's presence as they sat around. The atmosphere was upbeat and full of excitement for the ascent that was still to come. They came to a conclusion regarding their strategy, which stated that they would get up at 5 in the morning to complete their last preparations, with the intention of getting on the route and climbing to the summit of Love Peak no later than 7 o'clock. They were well aware that in order to make that happen, they needed to get some rest. Therefore, at 2 in the morning, they ensured that the lights in the cabin were turned out, and then all 4 of their companions went to bed. It was precisely 5 o'clock in the morning when the alarms went off, which was 3 hours later. At that moment, one of the companions reached over and turned on the light in the cabin. And at that particular moment, it was manifestly obvious that something was extremely, extremely wrong. He was not in his bed at the time. It was not until later that there was a feeling of panic. After looking over at his vacant bed, the other 3 buddies noticed that all of his personal possessions were still at the location where they had been left. All of his belongings, including his bag, his hiking gear, his wallet, and his phone, were arranged in an orderly fashion exactly where he had left them the previous evening. It was the first and most reasonable assumption that he must have gotten up a little bit earlier than usual and sneaked out of the cabin in a stealthy manner. It is possible that he needed to use the outhouse, or it is also possible that he simply desired to go outdoors and take a breath of fresh air. It was their assumption that he had simply been quiet in order to avoid waking them up and that he would return at any moment. As a result, the 3 buddies began to get ready for the day, disregarding Colin's absence from these preparations. They anticipated that he would return at any moment and go back through the door. Despite the fact that he had gone for a little walk before morning in order to stretch his legs, he was aware of the plan. He had a strict adherence to the plans. Without a doubt, he would return by 7 o'clock, which was the time that they had agreed upon for their departure. However, as the minutes ticked by steadily, a feeling of dread started to make its way into the room. There was a passing of 5:30. Then it is 6 o'clock. Next, it is 6:30. Colin has not been seen or heard from since. It was not a phone call. He had not sent a text message. Just now, he had disappeared. Concerns began to arise among the friends. Colin's behavior was utterly out of character in this regard. It was he who was accountable, the one who was an adept navigator. Without informing anyone of his intended destination, he would not just disappear into the night in the middle of the Siberian wilderness without a known destination. In no way did it make any sense at all. 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time that they had agreed to leave, Colin was still absent. With the passage of time, the original feeling of worry had developed into a full-blown concern. The region immediately surrounding the cabin was the subject of a speedy search that his friends conducted. They inquired about his name. The outhouse was examined once more by them. As the frost covered the ground, they searched for any footprints that might have been left behind. And still, they discovered nothing. It appeared as though he had simply exited the cabin and vanished from existence. It was as if he had passed away. They were aware that they needed to seek assistance at that point. Simply waiting around was no longer an option for them. A brief message was written by them before they left, and it was affixed to the front door of the cabin for safekeeping. The sender of the message was Colin. The note read something along the lines of, "If you come back and see this, we've gone to get help. We're looking for you. Please stay here or let someone know you're safe." After posting the note, the 3 friends left the cabin and went straight to the nearest police station in Arshan to let them know that their friend was missing. It was taken quite seriously by the local police department. Unusual was the disappearance of a young and experienced American outdoorsman who had been out in the wilderness. Almost immediately, they started a comprehensive search operation. An enormous search area was conducted, which encompassed the thick forest that surrounded the settlement of Arshan and extended all the way up the slopes of Love Peak itself. There were scores of local volunteers, including some individuals from the group that Colin had worked with in the past, who participated in the massive effort that was undertaken by law enforcement authorities, professional rescue teams, and other volunteers. Every single one of them was really worried since they were aware of how skilled he was. When Colin's family returned to the United States, they were confronted with the phone call that every parent dreads receiving. It was reported to them that their son had gone missing in Siberia. In response, they expressed complete and utter astonishment. A Colin? Is it lost? It appeared to be impossible. It turned out to be the young man who had spent years researching the environment in question. The individual in question was not a careless traveler who strayed off the path. It was almost as if he was an expert in the area. They made frantic efforts to obtain information, but in light of the fact that they were located thousands of miles away, they felt absolutely useless. They had no choice except to wait, hope, and pray for a solution. The search went on, day after day, without stopping. Due to the extreme weather conditions, which included freezing winds and snow on occasion, the search conditions were considered to be challenging and risky. In the Siberian wilderness, the expanse of the forest seemed intimidating. Out there, it is possible for a person to vanish without ever being located. The hope of discovering Colin alive began to dwindle as the days continued to pass, with one day turning into 2, then 3, and finally ending up being a full week. In the end, a breakthrough occurred on Monday, April 4th, which was 8 full days after Colin had vanished from the cabin over the previous week. Around 1 mile distant from the cabin, a group of people were searching through a part of forest while looking for the missing person. It was a heavily populated and challenging location to get through. A little clearing appeared in front of them as they made their way through the dense underbrush and the trees that were blocking their path. And in the midst of that expansive clearing, they caught sight of something. It was, as the search party got closer, that they realized their worst fears were correct. Yes, it was Colin. And it was too late for him. In the middle of the clearing, he was discovered lying on his back in a flat position. An odd, almost posed stance was arranged on his body, and it was quite peculiar. His right arm was also extended, but it was bent slightly and brought closer to his body. His left arm was stretched out straight to his side, and his right arm was also extended. At the same time, he had both of his palms gripped into a firm, tight fist. After conducting a more thorough investigation, the first responders discovered a number of unsettling details. On both of his wrists and on both of his hands, there were wounds and abrasions that were clearly evident. The pattern of these injuries appeared to be what a medical examiner would refer to as restraint marks. It appeared as though someone or something had been holding him down with a great deal of force. On the front of his neck, there were also scrapes and abrasions that were present. His attire, which included a thermal shirt with long sleeves, heavy-duty hiking pants, and his robust hiking boots, was ripped and torn in multiple places, which indicated that he had been involved in a violent conflict. In addition to that, there was a peculiar and insignificant information that would turn out to be of great importance. No socks were on Colin's feet at the time. Inside his hiking boots, which were tightly knotted, he was wearing his bare feet. Despite the fact that this may appear to be a trivial matter, for everyone who knew Colin, it was a significant warning sign. A substantial amount of scar tissue was left behind on Colin's ankles as a result of the procedures that he had previously undergone on both of them. It was something that he had mentioned to his friends and family on numerous occasions that if he did not wear thick socks, the scar tissue would scrape against the inside of his boots, causing him to experience excruciating discomfort. Never in his life did he go trekking without his socks on. He adhered to this norm in his daily life. Nevertheless, the state of the body was the aspect that the medical staff who initially inspected it found to be the most puzzling. It is reasonable to anticipate that a body would exhibit substantial signs of decomposition after being exposed to the environment and the animals for a period of 8 days in the remote regions of Siberia. Colin's body, on the other hand, exhibited hardly none. According to the remarks of one official, all of his wounds, including the cuts and abrasions on his wrists and neck, appeared to be fresh. It appeared as if the struggle and his death had occurred no more than a few moments ago. To put it succinctly, the scene did not give the impression that the person had become disoriented and had given in to the elements. It seemed as though the individual had lately been involved in a serious physical altercation, one that he had been unsuccessful in winning. The scene appeared to be that of a homicide. The Russian authorities proceeded with a stunning speed to shut the case. despite the fact that there was a lot of evidence that was both bizarre and persuasive. Their first hypothesis, which swiftly evolved into their official conclusion, was that all three of Colin's buddies had to have been involved in the crime. However, the friends were brought in for further interrogation, and they all denied having any involvement with Colin's death. Additionally, they all volunteered to take lie detector tests, which they all passed after they were given the opportunity to do so. It appeared as though the Russian authorities had lost interest in any other possible instances of foul play now that their major suspects had been implicated. Rapidly, they came to an agreement on a conclusive and formal answer. As a result, they came to the conclusion that Colin must have been under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both. During this changed state, they asserted that he must have wandered out of the cabin in a state of disorientation, become disoriented in the woods, and ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. It was determined that the case was closed. He died of a frozen state. The story has come to an end. The answer that was provided to Colin's parents was not only unsatisfactory, but it was also an insult to their son's memory. They were familiar with Colin. He was not a person who acted recklessly. It was not true that he was a drug user. Furthermore, he was an absolute master when it came to getting around in that particular region of Siberia. The concept that he would simply wander off and become so hopelessly lost that he would die of exposure a mile away from his cabin appeared to be totally absurd. The official account did not make sense, and there were an excessive number of questions that remained unresolved. All of the evidence, including the clenched fists, the restraining marks, the missing socks, the wounds that appeared to be new, and the absence of decomposition, did not fit into the straightforward story of a guy who died from freezing to death. Because they were unwilling to accept the official decision, Colin's parents made the decision to take matters into their own hands. They had the knowledge that they required an impartial and objective opinion. Therefore, they decided to use a private forensic laboratory that is situated in the United States and has a stellar reputation. They arranged for all of the material from the Russian autopsy, including the reports, the photographs, and the findings of the toxicological test, to be delivered to this laboratory for a comprehensive examination. Whether the conclusion reached by the Russians was correct, or whether something far more ominous had occurred to their son, they were interested in being informed. The American laboratory started its investigation, and it didn't take them long to discover significant flaws in the official position taken by the Russian government. As a matter of fact, their discoveries entirely disassembled it, each component by component. The toxicological report was the first thing that they looked at. The Russian authorities had proposed the idea that Colin was either under the influence of alcohol or drugs. After doing an analysis of the toxicology data, the laboratory in the United States came to the conclusion that this is unquestionably not true. Colin was not under the effect of alcohol at any point in it. When he was sober, an extremely minute and insignificant quantity of THC, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana, was discovered in his urine. On the other hand, the level was so low that it suggested that he had probably consumed it quite a few days, if not a week or perhaps more, before to his disappearance. It is quite unlikely that it would have had any kind of psychotropic impact on him on the night that he goes missing. This discovery was in direct and total opposition to the fundamental tenet of the hypothesis that the Russian police had been using. Second, the laboratory investigated the root of the death. The official diagnosis was hypothermia as the cause of death. But the forensic pathologists from the United States arrived at a different conclusion. According to the evidence that was found in the photographs taken during the autopsy, particularly the abrasions that were found on his neck, as well as other internal markers, they came to the conclusion that Colin did not die as a result of being exposed to the cold. All of the signals, on the other hand, pointed to a considerably more violent conclusion. Based on their findings, they concluded that suffocation was the most likely cause of death. He was the victim of a homicide. Until the moment he passed away, his capacity to breathe was severely restricted because someone had either suffocated him or crushed his airway. This brings us to the third and possibly most disturbing point. The laboratory examined the condition of Colin's body when it was discovered. It was corroborated by them that the initial responders had noticed the nearly complete absence of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries, and the fact that his body had not been touched by any animals that were foraging for food, which is quite unusual for a body that has been left in the woods for more than a week. In light of this information, they came to a conclusion that was shocking. It indicated that Colin had not passed away on the night that he could not be found. It indicated that he had been alive for the majority of the 8 days that hundreds of people had been searching for him, if not all of them simultaneously. The evidence strongly suggested that he had died within a very short time, most likely just a few hours before his body was discovered in that area on April 4th. This was the conclusion that was reached by using the evidence. These fresh discoveries from the American laboratory revealed a horrifying and devastating new picture of what must have occurred to Colin Madson because of his circumstances. The situation was not one in which a hiker became disoriented. This was a case of kidnapping and murdering the victim. Consequently, let us make an effort to reconstruct the events by using this new evidence that is more exact. On March 28, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, Colin awoke. This occurred somewhere in the pre-dawn hours of the day. He climbed out of his bed in a stealthy manner and exited the cabin. Utilizing the outhouse, which was located a short distance away, would be the most reasonable explanation for this behavior. His attire was not appropriate for a hike. Neither of his belongings were taken by him. Even his socks were not put on by him. The intention was for this to be a little excursion, nothing more than a minute or two, and then straight back to bed. As soon as he went out into the chilly and gloomy morning of Siberia, however, he discovered that he was not alone. They were waiting in the shadows, and it was either someone or some individuals. The fact that a violent struggle took place is something that we are aware of, but we do not know whether they ambushed him or whether they enticed him away from the cabin. These are the telltale indicators of a guy who is battling for his life. The shredded clothing, the abrasions on his hands and wrists, and the clenched fists. On the other hand, he was ultimately defeated. He had been kidnapped. Probably the most terrifying aspect of this enigma is what transpired after that with him. He was kidnapped from the environment surrounding the cabin and held captive for close to 8 days in a location unknown. This is where he was abducted. Why was he taken away from us? We are unable to provide responses to these queries. He was being detained against his will for a period of 8 days, during which time his friends, his family, and a large search party were making frantic efforts to locate him. Imagine the suffering that he must have been subjected to during that period of time. After that, his assailant or assailants murdered him on or around April 4th, which was the day that his body was discovered. Suffocation was the result. Following his passing, his body was relocated and positioned in that area in the forest, which was approximately 1 mile away from the cabin. Where is that? Would you say that the location was one that was chosen on purpose? Was the intention to make it simple to locate in order to convey some kind of message? Or was it simply a spot that was convenient for him to be left? When he is placed on his back with his arms extended, it gives the impression that he was placed there on purpose, rather than being a body that was simply abandoned. Therefore, the most important question is, who would do this and why would they do it? One theory, which is supported by a significant number of individuals, suggests that the Russian government or some local authorities are responsible. In Siberia, it was discovered that Colin, who had a strong commitment to protecting the environment, had taken part in at least one protest that was staged inside a peaceful setting. An unauthorized development in the area of Lake Baikal was the target of the protest. Following the conclusion of this demonstration, it is believed that Colin was issued a formal written warning by the Russian police, instructing him to refrain from attending any such rallies of this nature. What if this is the reason for it? Is it true that he was considered a problematic American activist? What happened to him? Was he singled out, kidnapped for questioning, and then murdered? This is a somewhat unsettling idea. It is possible that this is the reason why the official investigation was so quick to close off any line of inquiry that did not entail a straightforward accident. It's possible that a failed probe was actually a deliberate attempt to cover up the truth. On the other hand, this idea is not without its flaws. With so many other people participating in the demonstration, why would the government single out Colin? And why would they pick to kidnap him on a night when he was with three of his closest friends, individuals who would immediately notice his absence and raise the alarm if they were to find him missing? An operation that is being carried out in secret appears to be carried out in a very poor manner. There are other hypotheses that suggest it could have been a crime of opportunity, a robbery that went awry, or a personal quarrel with a nearby resident that we are unaware of. However, none of these hypotheses adequately explain the peculiar and protracted character of the crime, which consisted of the 8-day period of captivity prior to the murder. It was not surprising to see how the Russian authorities would respond to the discoveries that were discovered by the American laboratory. They were entirely disregarded by anyone. They remained steadfast in their judgment that the death was the result of hypothermia brought on by an accident. However, the investigation in Russia has not yet been concluded. This is not a riddle that needs to be solved for them. Those who were close to Colin described the event as a complete nightmare. Not only did they suffer the loss of their good buddy in the most heinous manner, but they also had to go through the agony of being the major suspects in his killing, even if it was only for a little period of time or for a short period of time. The shocking events that transpired over that week are likely to remain with them for the rest of their lives. The anguish that Colin's parents are experiencing is never-ending. Despite their best efforts, they have been unable to achieve justice for their son. The government of Russia does not give any cooperation, does not provide any fresh information, and there is no possibility that the case will ever be reopened. They are left with the horrific knowledge that their kid was murdered, but it is possible that they will never know who was responsible for the crime or why it was committed. When it comes to this investigation, they are forced to consider the same questions over and over again. Who was hiding in the shadows outside of that cabin in the early morning hours when it was completely dark? To what location did they take Colin? And during those 8 days when they were unable to find him, before they killed him and left him deep within that huge and merciless Siberian wilderness, what did they do to him? You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? One afternoon in September of 1951, a 53-year-old father named Adolphus Eller pulled his car up to a boarding house in the city of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He got out, went to the trunk, and lifted out a large cardboard box filled with his daughter's belongings. He carried it up the steps, through the front door, and down a hallway to a room where his two 21-year-old daughters were already busy unpacking. Their names were Bobby and Betty. For the two young women, this was the most exciting day of their lives. They were moving out of their childhood home in the small, quiet town of Pearl Lear, about an hour's drive away. It was the first time they would be living on their own, away from their father, Adolphus, and their mother. They had both gotten jobs at the same cigarette factory, a major employer in the area, and they were going to be sharing this room together in the boarding house. It was a huge step for them, the real beginning of their adult lives. You could see the excitement just radiating off of them as they put their clothes into drawers and decided where to hang their pictures. But for their dad, Adolphus, the moment was bittersweet. On the one hand, he was incredibly proud. His girls were growing up, making their own way in the world. That's all any parent wants. But on the other hand, it was hard to let go. They were his little girls. He watched them for a moment, chattering and laughing, and felt a familiar mix of pride and sadness. Even though they were leaving the nest, he took comfort in one very important fact. They were still together. They were living together, working at the same place. He knew that even if he and their mom couldn't be there every day to look after them, they would always have each other. And that made him feel like they would be okay. You see, Bobby and Betty were not just sisters. They were identical twins. And their bond was deeper and more intense than most people could ever really understand. It went far beyond just being close siblings. They had a connection that seemed to defy normal explanation. They leaned into their identity as twins in every possible way. Physically, they were almost impossible to tell apart. Both stood at 5 feet 3 inches tall, with round faces and dark hair, which they always made sure to style in the exact same way. If one got a new haircut, the other would be in the salon the very next day getting the same one. But it went so much deeper than just their appearance. Their personalities and interests were almost perfectly mirrored to a point that it sometimes seemed deliberate, almost forced. Both were social and outgoing. Both played the piano beautifully. They sang together in the school glee club. They both got good grades. It was as if they were two halves of a single person. But then there were the things they shared that just didn't seem possible. For example, they had a strange habit of getting sick at the exact same time, even with illnesses that weren't contagious. There was one instance that Adolphus and his wife never forgot. Bobby had developed a painful abscess on one of her teeth. She was genuinely sick from it, with a fever and a swollen jaw. It was a serious infection. Then, completely out of the blue, Betty developed an abscess in the very same tooth. The doctors couldn't explain it. This wasn't something you could fake or imagine. It was a real physical ailment that she had developed at the exact same moment as her twin sister. It was just one of many examples of their strange, unexplainable connection. And on the rare occasions when some difference was forced upon them, they would work very intentionally to erase that difference and become the same again. When Bobby's eyesight started to fail and she needed glasses, she was a little self-conscious about it. Betty, whose vision was perfectly fine, begged her parents to let her get glasses too. She didn't need them, but she couldn't stand the idea of being different from her sister in any way. So, she got a pair of glasses with plain lenses, just so they could look identical again. So now, this big move to Winston-Salem was just the next chapter in their shared life. The same job, the same factory, the same room, in the same boarding house. It was how they had always done things. A part of Adolphus and his wife had secretly hoped that as they got older, Bobby and Betty might start to become a little more independent of each other. It just seemed like the healthy, natural thing to do. But as he put down that last box and looked at his two daughters, both with the same wide, excited smile on their faces, he felt a wave of gratitude. Maybe this was for the best. This was a good intermediate step. They could take this leap into adulthood together, leaning on each other. It was a bridge. After a few more minutes of helping them get settled, Adolphus knew it was time to go. He gave them both a long hug and said, "Okay, I'm going to take off now. Best of luck. I love you both. Call whenever you need anything." And with that, he walked out, got in his car, and began the quiet, lonely drive back home. Fast forward 2 years. Adolphus was at home in Pearl Lear, setting the dining room table while his wife finished cooking dinner in the kitchen. It was a weekend, and Adolphus felt that familiar sense of happy anticipation. For the past 2 years, without fail, Bobby and Betty had driven home from Winston-Salem every single weekend to visit. It was the highlight of the week for Adolphus and his wife. They cherished this time with their daughters, hearing all about their jobs and their new lives. Just as Adolphus placed the last dinner plate on the table, he heard a knock at the front door. He smiled to himself. Right on time. "They're here," he called to his wife. He walked to the door, ready to greet both of his girls, but when he opened it, he was surprised. It was just Bobby. Betty was nowhere in sight. He looked past her, toward the driveway, expecting to see Betty getting out of the car. He asked, "Where's Betty? Is she in the car?" Bobby just shook her head and said no. That's when Adolphus noticed that Bobby had luggage with her, a couple of suitcases, and she looked terribly sad. Her usual bright expression was gone, replaced by a look of deep unhappiness, almost depression. "Bobby, what's going on?" he asked, his heart starting to sink. She looked down at the ground and said quietly, "I hated my job at the factory. I hated it. So I quit. I'm coming home." Adolphus was stunned. This was a huge shift. the twins did everything together. They always had. Even if one of them wasn't particularly interested in something, she would usually go along with it just to maintain their sameness. The idea that one would quit this big new life they had built together while the other stayed was a massive departure from their entire history. Adolphus tried to process it. "And Betty?" he asked. "She doesn't hate her job. She's going to stay. She's going to keep working at the factory and living there." The news was jarring. But then he shifted focus back to the immediate situation. "Okay, well, of course you can stay here. Of course you can come home. But where's Betty? Is she coming to visit this weekend? Even if she's still working, she's still coming for the weekend, right?" Again, Bobby shook her head. "No. She's staying in Winston-Salem this weekend." This was another shock. They had never missed a weekend visit. It just felt like the world had tilted on its axis. What was going on with his girls? But Adolphus pushed his confusion aside. His daughter was hurting. He put his arm around her and said, "Look, just come on in. Have some dinner. Get settled. We'll talk about this. We'll figure out what your next steps are. Of course, you can stay here. Everything will be fine." Bobby picked up her bags and stepped inside. But as her mother came out to greet her, Bobby just said she wasn't hungry and didn't want to eat. Then she walked straight up to her old bedroom, brought her things inside, and shut the door. She didn't come out again that night. And for the next 2 years, that's mostly where Bobby stayed. In her bedroom, the door was almost always closed. She rarely left the room, and when she did, it was just for brief trips to the bathroom or to get a glass of water, and then she would retreat right back into her sanctuary. She had almost completely shut down. She never explained to her parents what she hated so much about the factory job. She never talked about anything, really. The social, extroverted girl they knew had vanished. In her place was a recluse. She didn't try to reconnect with any of her old friends from high school. She didn't look for a new job or show any interest in her future. It was as if her life had just stopped. She was just existing, day after day, inside those 4 walls. But there was one thing that could bring the old Bobby back, if only for a little while. And that was when Betty came home to visit on the weekends. The moment Betty walked through the front door, it was like a switch was flipped. Bobby would emerge from her room, her face would light up, and she would instantly become her old self again. The two of them would fall right back into their old rhythm, laughing and talking as if no time had passed. There was no resentment, no awkwardness about the fact that their lives had taken such different paths. For those 2 days, everything was normal again. And then, Sunday evening would come, Betty would leave to go back to her job and her life in Winston-Salem, and Bobby would walk back into her bedroom and shut the door. The light would go out again. For Adolphus and his wife, it was agonizing to watch. They had always hoped their daughters would find some independence. But now it seemed that while Betty was managing to do okay on her own, Bobby was completely falling apart without her sister. She was utterly dependent on Betty for her happiness, for her very sense of self. It was so clear. Adolphus didn't know how this could ever be resolved. It just seemed to be getting worse and worse for Bobby as time went on. Then, around the 2-year mark of Bobby being home, something else unexpected happened. Betty came home one Friday for her usual weekend visit. But this time, she had luggage with her, just like Bobby had 2 years prior. She walked in and announced, "I quit the factory too. I'm moving back home." In a strange way, Adolphus and his wife felt a sense of relief. Their first thought was for Bobby. This had to be a good thing for her. With Betty home for good, surely Bobby would return to her normal self. They had seen how happy she was every time Betty visited. Maybe now that happiness would be permanent. But there was also a sense of unease. It just didn't make sense for Betty to quit her job. She seemed to like it. She seemed to be thriving on her own. Adolphus couldn't prove it, but he had a strong suspicion about what was really happening. He believed Betty was making a sacrifice. She was giving up her independent life to come home and be with her sister, to fall back into step with her just like they always did. It seemed like the only explanation. Still, the silver lining was that maybe, just maybe, their daughters would be happy and healthy again. But that is not what happened. Once Betty was back home, the two sisters did fall back in step with each other, just as their parents had predicted. But it wasn't a return to their old happy selves. Their connection, their dependence on each other, became more extreme than it had ever been before. And it had already been extreme. This was something else entirely. They both moved into Bobby's old bedroom. They went inside, shut the door, and basically never came out. They didn't become the extroverted girls they used to be. Instead, they became introverted together. They showed no interest in finding jobs, socializing with friends, or doing anything at all. They just stayed in that room, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They slept in the same bed. On the rare occasions they did leave the bedroom, they were physically inseparable. They would walk side by side, their shoulders touching. They moved in perfect sync, almost like robots. If one went to the kitchen, the other went too. If one went to the bathroom, the other went with her. They could not be apart, not even for a second. It was a level of attachment that their parents had never seen before, and it was deeply unsettling. Adolphus and his wife were terrified. They didn't even have a name for what they were witnessing. It was codependency on a level that seemed pathological. They kept hoping that it was just a phase, that the girls would eventually level out and get their lives back on track. But then it got even worse. On top of everything else, they stopped eating. At first, it was just occasional. Adolphus would go up to the bedroom at dinner time and knock on the door. It would open just a crack, and both Bobby's and Betty's faces would appear in the gap, looking out at him. Adolphus would say, "Hey, dinner's on the table. Are you coming down to eat?" And the girls, without even looking at each other, would respond in perfect, eerie unison, "We're not hungry." Then they would shut the door. It happened night after night. Weeks went by, and the girls were refusing almost all food. They began to lose a shocking amount of weight. Their faces became gaunt, their bodies frail. But no matter how much their parents begged and pleaded with them, they just would not eat. After a few weeks of this, Adolphus and his wife knew they couldn't handle this on their own. Logic wasn't working. Pleading wasn't working. There was something deeply wrong, and it seemed increasingly obvious that it was a serious mental health issue. They made the difficult decision to seek professional help. They brought Bobby and Betty to see a psychiatrist. After several sessions with the twins, the psychiatrist gave them a diagnosis. He said that both Bobby and Betty had schizophrenia, a very serious and chronic brain disorder that can dramatically affect a person's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. The psychiatrist explained that many of their strange behaviors, particularly their extreme codependency and their refusal to eat, could be symptoms of this illness. He prescribed them both powerful antipsychotic medication and assured Adolphus and his wife that if the twins took their medicine as directed, they would get better. The parents felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, they had an answer and a path forward. They made sure Bobby and Betty took their medication every single day, exactly as prescribed. But the twins didn't get any better. In fact, they seemed to get worse. They spent even more time locked in their bedroom. They became even more frail. And they started showing signs of extreme paranoia. They were mistrustful of everyone, including their own parents. It was as if the only person in the world each of them could trust was the other. Anyone else was a threat. Pretty quickly, Adolphus realized the medication wasn't working. He didn't necessarily doubt the diagnosis. The symptoms of schizophrenia seemed to fit what he was seeing. But the treatment was failing. He decided they needed more intensive help, a higher level of care. So, in early 1961, when Bobby and Betty were now 30 years old, Adolphus made the heartbreaking decision to have them both involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. At first, it seemed to be exactly what they needed. At the hospital, they were monitored around the clock. The staff made sure they ate their meals, so they started to gain weight back. They were given proper medication under professional supervision. And, crucially, the hospital staff allowed them to stay in the same room together. They were never separated, and having each other for support seemed to be a key part of their recovery. After several weeks, they were deemed healthy enough to be discharged. They seemed to be back to their old selves. But almost as soon as they got back to their family home, they regressed. They went right back to their bedroom, shut the door, and the whole destructive cycle started all over again. The seclusion, the not eating, the paranoia. And so, they were committed to the hospital again. And again, they got better while they were there. And again, they were discharged. And again, they got worse as soon as they were home. This pattern repeated over and over again for more than a year. They were in and out of the hospital, trapped in a loop with no real progress being made. Eventually, Adolphus, his wife, and the team of doctors and nurses who had been treating the twins came to a difficult and controversial conclusion. They started to wonder if the root of the problem wasn't schizophrenia at all. Maybe the schizophrenia was a symptom of a deeper issue. Maybe the problem was their intense, all-consuming dependency on each other. What had once seemed like a beautiful, timeless bond between sisters was now being viewed as a deeply unhealthy, pathological codependency. They were so enmeshed with each other that neither of them could function as an individual. They were stuck, and unless some drastic action was taken, they would continue this downward spiral indefinitely. And so, a decision was made. A radical, last-ditch effort to save them. Without telling the girls, the doctors and their parents agreed that they had to be forcibly separated. And so, on the 11th of April, 1962, Bobby and Betty were once again committed to the hospital. But this time was different. For the very first time in their lives, they were separated. They were put in rooms at opposite ends of the hospital in completely separate wards. When they realized what was happening, they completely lost their minds. They begged, they screamed, they cried, demanding to be put back together. But the staff held firm, telling them it was for their own good. A few hours later, in the dead of night, it was around 1 a.m. on April 12th. Adolphus was at home, asleep in his bed. The phone rang, jolting him awake. He was confused. Who would be calling at this hour? He picked it up and heard the voice of one of the hospital doctors on the other end. The doctor sounded frantic, his voice shaking. He was trying to explain to Adolphus what had happened after the girls were separated, but the words were tumbling out in a jumbled, panicked mess. Adolphus couldn't make sense of it. He kept asking, "What are you talking about? What happened?" Finally, the doctor took a deep breath, paused, and then very clearly stated the unbelievable, disastrous thing that had unfolded. It was something no one could have ever planned for, something the doctor himself couldn't comprehend. As Adolphus listened, he just sat there on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, completely frozen, unable to process the words he was hearing. Over the next few days, the doctors at that psychiatric hospital tried to find a rational, scientific explanation for what had happened on the night Bobby and Betty were separated. They couldn't. They were completely baffled. So, they called in the North Carolina State Board of Investigators for help. The investigators came, they looked at all the evidence, and they couldn't figure it out either. So, they called in the FBI. The federal agents reviewed the case, and they too were stumped. Nobody had any idea how this could have happened. As the story inevitably leaked to the press, it became a national sensation. Newspapers all over the country ran articles about the unbelievable mystery of the Eller twins. And as people read the story, many began to wonder if the explanation wasn't rooted in science at all. Maybe what had happened was something beyond our human understanding. Something that science couldn't measure or explain, but that didn't make it any less real. It turns out that at 12:55 a.m. on the night the twins were separated, a nurse in the ward where Bobby had been placed was doing her regular rounds. When she got to Bobby's room, she looked in and saw Bobby lying in her bed, on her side. The nurse thought she was asleep, but when she went to check on her, she discovered that Bobby was dead. Just 5 minutes later, at exactly 1 a.m., a doctor went to check on Betty in her room on the complete other side of the hospital. The doctor found Betty dead in her bed, lying in the exact same position as her sister. The most baffling part was that there was no obvious cause of death for either of them. There were no signs of illness, no signs of self-harm, no signs of foul play or violence of any kind. It was as if, at almost the exact same moment, both of their bodies had simply decided to stop working. Even after multiple thorough autopsies were performed, no medical reason for their deaths could be found. They hadn't been poisoned. They didn't have heart attacks or strokes. Medically speaking, they were healthy one moment and dead the next. The only conclusion anyone could draw was that the twins had died simultaneously from no apparent cause. Their official cause of death was listed as ill-defined and unknown. The only theory that ever emerged came from one of the doctors who had treated them. He believed that Bobby and Betty were so deeply distressed by being forcibly separated that they had found a way to reunite. He suggested that they had, in his words, willed themselves to die. He proposed that their spiritual, physical, and emotional need to be together was so powerful that when it was taken away, their bodies simply shut down in the hope that their spirits could reconnect in death. It's a wild, unbelievable theory. But there is one final strange detail about the way they died that seems to lend it a chilling layer of credibility. It suggests that whatever happened that night was something truly beyond our comprehension. When the staff found Bobby and Betty's bodies just 5 minutes apart on opposite ends of the hospital, they weren't just lying in the same position. They were positioned on their beds in a slightly awkward, unnatural way. You know how a bed is a rectangle, and you normally lie on it vertically, parallel to the long sides. Well, the girls were found lying at a slight angle on their respective beds. At first, it was just noted as a strange anomaly. But then, someone had a thought. They imagined what it would look like if you could remove all the walls of the hospital. If you could see from Bobby's room all the way down the corridors to Betty's room, and when they mapped it out, they realized the strange angle wasn't random at all. The way the girls had positioned themselves on their beds meant that through all those walls and all that distance, they were looking directly at each other at the moment they died. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One night in December of 2009, a man was digging through a pile of papers and photo albums inside of an RV that was parked in Texas. The man had recently bought this trailer after its previous owner had died. And so now he was finding it was full of junk that he was trying to sort through. And as he rifled through the documents, he stumbled on a stack of old notebooks. He opened one up and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heartbeat pick up because the notebooks were actually diaries. They were full of handwritten rantings about demons and monsters and a deal with the devil. But that wasn't what scared him. What really scared the guy was this writer's horrifying confession. On the night of the 24th of July, 1987, a 30-year-old woman named Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hyco, located in central Texas. She was there with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. The three of them were just standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay or if they should just leave. As they stood there, they could hear people having fun on all the rides. There were kids laughing and screaming. It was a Friday night, and they had chosen to come here. This was supposed to be their fun activity for the evening. But so far, the night really had not been that great. Susan's best friend, a woman named Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, a man named Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them to this fair because Susan's life, of late, had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of a very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she had been dating had wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyway, were in pretty rough shape. Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and, for at least one night, just come enjoy this fair. Forget about everything else and just have some fun. And so, Susan had agreed to go. However, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around, playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at a fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that she wasn't really having a good time. She said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she just couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio was standing at the gate, wondering if it was even worth staying any longer. Ultimately, Roy finally just said, "You know what? Why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too." He suggested they could go back to Stephenville and just drive around for a bit, and eventually they could go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and get some ice cream. When Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought it was a great idea. And so they left. They hopped in Roy's truck and began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that feeling that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away. And so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having a great night, the first one in a long time. It felt like the last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February. He had taken her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected. And he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce. And then, instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory where she worked in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex, and with all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped her pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends, and a lot of close cousins. She had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so, slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy, jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. And she just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life is turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table, and, without saying anything, she walked up to the counter, and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. When she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like she had been set free. She was just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked. And then all day Sunday, she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry. She had made the bed and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over at her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also, she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy. And Susan by this point believed she had found almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet and then go to bed because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. 2 days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days and nobody could get a hold of her, and so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said, no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside and he called his daughter's name, but he didn't get a response. So, he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something was wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. His daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then it's like he broke out of his fog. He stumbled backwards. He ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, hey, what are you doing here? But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter. And based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then, after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands. And then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume. And so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable, except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress. And also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. This had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning, at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So, after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages, but he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died. Although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a doorframe to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case. So everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this. Not only because he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work. So there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. 2 days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help scanning the mourners through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing. And Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis. And word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis. Which meant that as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet. And Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands, and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then, one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so, without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed, and then went to get Susan's file. And then, after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory. And so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee. And then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer. and she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitar shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so, realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bowman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C.'s story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said, yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bowman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay. But J.C. got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of J.C. So he decided to push pretty early and see how J.C. reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked J.C. where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered based primarily on the autopsy report. And when J.C. was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make J.C. look that good. So Hensley asked J.C. if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, J.C., had pressured her for sex. J.C. turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that J.C. was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel J.C. to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first, but he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, J.C. said, yes, you can have my fingerprints, and he almost seemed relieved. He said, whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it. 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had J.C.'s finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog. So his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for two reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And two, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan, and Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So, that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut. So he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, and Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons and Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons and Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time, in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons and Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons and Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd match the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect. Or, more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed. That's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly it was totally... Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime. So Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then, one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out. And at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement because, through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS crime lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspect's fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table. And as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bowman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael. Because Michael is this enraged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke, and he smoked cigarettes just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these 3 men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion and finally just total disbelief because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father, Joe, his friend, some closure, but now he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes. He studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone. And he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown print against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print. So, the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here. But he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, 1987. Stephenville's main street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts. And as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. So, the killer stayed half-drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so, they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram. And then the killer stripped off their clothes. They stretched out on the floor and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then. But now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road, and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door, and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile, and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back, and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her, but Susan immediately pulled back. Suddenly angry, the killer grabbed her and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years. But that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark. And he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley. And just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the roundtable. And Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason, pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so, on the 7th of June 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons. And Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a strange, quiet space that exists at the very edge of human endurance. A place where all of our modern comforts, our safety nets, and our predictable routines are completely stripped away. For most of us, our daily lives are defined by a sense of security. We wake up in our warm beds, we go to work, we buy food at the grocery store, and we assume that the world will continue to make sense. We rarely, if ever, have to contemplate what we would do if our survival was suddenly put on the line. But every once in a while, a single unexpected event can shatter that illusion, thrusting ordinary people into situations so hostile, so extreme, and so terrifying that they seem almost impossible to survive. Today, we are going to explore 3 incredible stories of individuals who were pushed far beyond the limits of physical and mental exhaustion. These are people who found themselves completely alone in some of the most unforgiving environments on our planet, with no help on the way, no food, and absolutely no logical reason to believe they would live to see another day. Yet, in the face of certain death, they did not give up. Instead, they tapped into a deep, primal well of resilience, proving that the human will to survive is one of the most powerful and mysterious forces in existence. Let us begin our journey in the year 1983 on the warm, sun-kissed docks of Tahiti. This is where we meet 23-year-old Tommy Ashcraft. Tommy was a free spirit, a young woman who had fallen in love with the ocean and the ultimate freedom of the sailing lifestyle. She was adventurous, capable, and had spent years learning the complex, demanding art of ocean navigation. It was during her travels that she met 34-year-old Richard Sharp, a seasoned British sailor who shared her deep passion for the sea. The two quickly formed an inseparable bond, united by their shared love of adventure and the open water. They spent more time living on boats than they did on land, dreaming of a future where they would sail around the world together. They were young, they were in love, and they felt entirely invincible. In October of that year, a close friend approached the couple with an incredible opportunity. The friend needed someone to deliver his luxury 44-foot yacht, a vessel named the Hazana, from the tropical waters of Tahiti all the way to San Diego, California. This was a massive undertaking. The journey would cover over 4,000 miles of open, unpredictable ocean. It was a significantly longer and more demanding trip than either Tammy or Richard had ever attempted before. But they were highly confident in their seafaring abilities, and the prospect of spending weeks navigating the deep blue sea together was too exciting to pass up. They gladly accepted the job, packed their gear, and set sail into the vast Pacific. For the first 2 weeks, the voyage was everything they had hoped for. The weather was perfect, the winds were steady, and the Hazana cut through the water with ease. But as they sailed just north of the equator, the ship's weather radio began to crackle with concerning news. A tropical disturbance had formed in the region, and it was rapidly intensifying into a massive hurricane named Raymond. Initially, Tammy and Richard did not panic. They knew that hurricanes in this part of the Pacific often changed direction or weakened before they could cause major damage to a vessel as sturdy as the Hazana. However, they decided that it was still in their best interest to be cautious. They adjusted their sails and altered their course, hoping to sail completely out of the storm's path and find calmer, safer waters. But the ocean had other plans. Over the next couple of days, Hurricane Raymond did not weaken. Instead, it grew into a terrifying Category 4 storm, and its path became highly erratic. Every time Tammy and Richard changed direction to get away from the storm, the hurricane seemed to shift with them, speeding up and closing the distance. It felt as if a massive, malevolent force was actively tracking them across the water. Soon, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple, the wind began to howl with a deafening roar, and the waves grew into towering, foaming walls of water. They realized they could no longer outrun the storm. They were going to have to weather it. They went to work securing the yacht. They put on their heavy, waterproof rain gear, boarded up the cabin windows with thick wooden panels, and double-checked all the safety lines. When they stood on the deck, looking out at the horizon, the scene was absolutely paralyzing. Tammy would later say that she had never truly understood the absolute terror of a hurricane until she was trapped in one. The waves were 50 feet tall, giant walls of black water that lifted the 44-foot yacht into the air, making it completely airborne before sending it crashing down into the deep troughs below. Each time the boat landed, it felt as though the entire structure would break in half. Immediately after each crash, a massive wave would break over the deck, burying the boat in water and threatening to drag them down into the depths. Richard was at the helm, fighting the steering wheel with all his strength. He was an incredibly skilled sailor, and he managed to find a way to ride the waves, steering the boat at just the right angle to prevent it from capsizing. For hours, they fought the storm in a state of absolute chaos. Eventually, the wind began to die down slightly, and the waves, though still massive, became more predictable. It seemed as though they had made it through the worst of the hurricane and that they would survive. At this point, Tommy was completely exhausted. The sheer physical and mental stress of the battle had left her barely able to stand. Richard, who was anchored to the cockpit by a heavy safety line, noticed her fatigue. He told her to go down into the cabin, get some dry clothes, and try to get some rest. He assured her that he had everything under control. Tammy was incredibly grateful. She opened the heavy cabin doors, stepped inside, and made her way down the steps. But just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard Richard scream from the deck. "Oh my God," he yelled. Before Tommy could even react, a massive rogue wave, a towering wall of water that had been hidden by the darkness, struck the Hazana head-on. The force of the impact was so great that it flipped the entire 44-foot yacht completely upside down in a violent backflip. Inside the cabin, Tammy felt the floor instantly vanish. She was thrown violently across the room, her head slamming hard against a wooden cabinet. She was knocked unconscious instantly, and the world went silent. When Tammy finally woke up, 27 hours had passed. She opened her eyes to a scene of absolute devastation. She was lying on the floor of the cabin, partially submerged in cold water. The space was a disaster area. The force of the capsize had shattered the furniture, throwing heavy tools, wet papers, and navigation charts all over the floor. The boat, after being flipped completely upside down, had somehow been rolled upright again by another wave while she lay unconscious. But Tammy's head was throbbing with a severe concussion, and she could barely comprehend where she was or what had happened. Her mind was in a fog, but her survival instincts immediately took over. she knew she had to find Richard. She dragged herself out of the water, climbed the wet, slippery stairs, and pushed open the cabin doors to step out onto the deck. What she saw was a scene of utter horror. The Hazana was completely ruined. Both of the massive masts had snapped off, and the sails were dragging in the water, acting like heavy anchors that were slowly pulling the boat down. The deck had been stripped bare of all equipment. Tommy began to scream Richard's name, her voice cracking with panic, but there was no answer. She rushed to the cockpit where she had last seen him. And then she saw it. Richard's safety line, which had been securely attached to the boat, was dangling over the side of the yacht. She pulled the line up, and her heart shattered. The heavy metal safety harness had actually broken under the immense force of the wave. Richard was gone. He had been swept into the freezing, empty ocean. He was not wearing a life jacket, having taken it off earlier when the storm had briefly calmed down. Tommy was filled with an overwhelming wave of grief. She wanted to sit down and cry, to mourn the loss of the man she loved. But she knew that if she did, she would die too. The boat was slowly sinking. The engine was dead, the radio was ruined by salt water, and the electronic navigation and emergency beacon systems were completely destroyed. She was entirely alone in the very middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no ships, no land, and no hope of rescue. But Tommy refused to give up. She began to act like a robot, focusing entirely on the physical tasks required to survive. She went below deck and began manually pumping the water out of the cabin. She returned to the deck and, using her knowledge of rigging, managed to build a makeshift mast and sail out of the broken debris. She searched the ruined cabin and found that some of the marine almanacs were still dry. By studying the maps, she identifies a major ocean current that she thought she could get to. Using just a sextant and a watch, she manually navigated this broken-down, leaking ship into this current, steering toward Hawaii, which was about 1,500 miles away. For 41 days, Tammy survived on canned food and peanut butter. She manually navigated her ship using only the sun, the stars, the watch, and her sextant. Every single day was a battle against despair. She knew that if her calculations were off by even a fraction of a degree, she would sail past Hawaii and drift out into the endless open waters of the Pacific, where she would run out of food and water and die. But her calculations were flawless. When Tommy finally stepped foot on land in Hawaii, she was relieved that she had made it, but at the same time, she had this sudden flood of emotions. She was so incredibly sad about the loss of Richard. It was like she really had not had a chance to grieve his loss, because that whole time after the accident, her entire focus had been on survival. Although Tammy would make a full recovery, it would take her 6 years to learn how to read again because of the severe head injury she sustained when the boat capsized. But when she did regain that skill, she finally stopped and she wrote her and Richard's story in a book called Red Sky in Morning, which became an international bestseller and was later converted into a movie called Adrift. Now, let us travel from the deep blue waters of the Pacific to the scorching, barren expanse of the Australian outback. This is a place of extreme heat, red dirt, and deadly silence, an environment where a single mistake can easily cost you your life. Growing up in southeastern Australia, Ricky McGee worked a variety of jobs, including being a carpet salesman, a prawn fisherman, a nightclub doorman, an electrician, and a bailiff. In 2006, when Ricky was 35, he was offered yet another new job in a government department in Western Australia. He accepted the job, hopped in his car, and began the long drive across the desert. While on the extremely desolate Buntine Highway, which is basically a road in the middle of the desert with nothing around, no people, no buildings, nothing, he was driving along and he saw a group of 3 men standing outside of their car. Ricky assumed they must have broken down, so he pulled over to ask if they needed help. They came up to him and were so grateful that he stopped. They told him they had run out of gas and asked if they could hop in with him and ride up to the next town. Ricky said, "Fine, climb on in." The three men got into his car and they took off. After that, Ricky has no memory of what happened. He believes one of them drugged him by putting something in his drink, which was sitting in the center console and was open, but he does not know for sure. Ricky remembers waking up, and he was in a camp. He sat up, unrestrained, and looked out in front of him. The three guys who had gotten into the car with him were sitting on rocks, looking at him, and one of them had a gun that he was aiming directly at Ricky. Ricky was just looking around, not really sure what was going on, when one of them got up, came over, and offered him water. Ricky took a sip of the water because he was extremely thirsty, and he believes the water was poisoned as well because shortly after taking a sip, he passed out again. When Ricky regained consciousness a second time, he could not move. It was completely dark, and he felt something tugging at his skin. As he lay there, he realized there was black plastic right over his face. He had been buried alive. He then realized there was a wild dingo standing on his chest that had tugged the plastic away from his face because the dog was trying to take a bite out of him. But the dog was actually the one that saved his life by creating an air pocket in the plastic. Ricky screamed at the dog, and the animal panicked, leaping out of the hole and running away. Ricky was able to work his fingers up to this hole, pull it all the way open, and push himself out of the plastic. He realized there was not much dirt or rocks placed over him. They probably thought he would just suffocate in the middle of the desert and no one would find him anyway. He stood up in his grave and looked around. There was no sign of the three men, and his car was gone. They had also taken all of his clothing, even his shoes. He had no food, no water, and he was in the middle of the desert with no roads, no people, and no buildings in sight. Confusion overtook Ricky because he just could not make sense of what had happened to him. Who were these three people? Why did they attack him? Did they just want to steal his car, and were they prepared to kill him just to take it? He sat down in the shade of a small bush and stayed there for several hours, thinking about what to do, but he was not one to let pessimism crowd his psyche. He decided that if he was going to survive, he needed to get up and get moving. After 10 days of just wandering through the desert and seeing absolutely nobody, he came across a fairly large water hole. He decided that he would have a better chance of surviving if he just waited there until someone came and rescued him, rather than keeping on walking through the desert where he was bound to eventually collapse and die. So, he made a makeshift shelter next to the water hole and began to wait. After almost a week of being at this spot, Ricky had still not had a single thing to eat since his ordeal began. His stomach was in knots, he was in extreme pain, and he was starving. Just then, a lizard happened to run across the ground in front of him. Without even thinking, he reached out, grabbed it, and took a bite out of it. It was like a primal side of him was suddenly unleashed, and he had no issues eating anything that moved. For weeks, Ricky stayed at this spot, drinking from the water hole and eating lizards, frogs, leeches, snakes, grasshoppers, and caterpillars. Basically, anything that moved anywhere near his camp, he would chase it down and eat it. He actually developed an affinity for certain frogs over others, and he said that in terms of eating leeches, they were okay, but you needed to eat them really quickly, otherwise they would attach to the inside of your mouth. He also ate plants, though he had no idea what was harmful and what was safe. He just ate what tasted good and got lucky. But as much as Ricky was eating, it was not enough. He was slowly losing his battle with the desert, and he was starving to death. He believed he did not have enough time to just continue waiting at this particular spot, and that he needed to go out and find help. So, he left the waterhole and began stumbling through the desert all over again. But he was so weak that he only lasted for a couple of days before he found another waterhole. He stopped there and built yet another shelter, this time believing it would become his tomb. Over the next couple of days, wild dogs began coming to his camp and circling his shelter. It was like they knew he was about to die soon, or they at least knew he was weak enough that they could probably overpower him. At night, Ricky had to barricade the door of his shelter because the dogs would get aggressive, coming up to the door and trying to paw their way inside. On the 70th day of his ordeal, Ricky believed he was probably within a day or two of passing away, so he put a makeshift cross on the outside of his shelter. He believed this place would be his tomb, and he wanted someone to notice the cross, find his body, and let his family know what had happened to him. But on the 71st day, when Ricky happened to be standing outside of his shelter, two ranch hands who were way off the road in the outback happened to look in his direction, and they saw him. When they went over to him, they said he looked like a walking skeleton. Ricky practically collapsed as soon as he saw help had finally arrived. The ranch hands evacuated Ricky from the desert and brought him to a hospital where he weighed less than 100 pounds. At the beginning of his ordeal, he had weighed over 230 pounds. Despite filing a detailed report with the police about the three men who attacked him, they were never caught. Ricky checked himself out of the hospital after 6 days and made a full recovery. He ended up writing a book about his experience, and he now works construction in Dubai. Now, let us turn our attention to our final story, which takes us from the hot sands of Australia to the freezing vertical world of the Peruvian Andes. This is a place where the air is thin, the cold is bone-chilling, and a single misstep can send you falling thousands of feet to your death. By 1985, the remote and extremely dangerous west face of the Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes was still unclimbed. But in 1985, two very ambitious climbers, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and 21-year-old Simon Yates, decided they were going to be the first to conquer it. By all accounts, they seemed up for the job, having already conquered numerous difficult Scottish ice cliffs, as well as a number of large mountain faces in the Alps. So, in early June of that year, the pair flew to Peru and arrived at the base camp nearest to the Ciula Grande. It was still 5 miles away, so they could not actually see the face they were going to climb yet. On June 5th, when the weather was good enough, the pair left camp and worked their way around the huge lake and across the glacier to the base of this massive cliff. When they saw it for the first time, they could not believe how steep and dangerous it looked. But over the next 3 days, they managed to make it up this cliff despite a blizzard hitting them halfway through, and they reached the summit. To them, this was a crowning achievement. They had done it, and they had written their names in the history books. But in reality, the thing that people would remember them for was not for reaching the top of Ciula Grande, it was for what happened when they started going down. Because of how steep this mountain was, and because of the blizzard that was not going away but was actually getting worse, the descent was going to be much more challenging than the ascent. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the morning of June 8th, Joe and Simon left the summit and began very carefully making their way down the mountain. At 11 o'clock, disaster struck. Joe lost his footing and fell to the bottom of an ice cliff, shattering his leg. Initially, they both assumed this was a death sentence for Joe. There was no way he could climb down the mountain, and certainly Simon could not carry him down. They were so high up, and it was so steep that it seemed impossible. But Simon wanted to at least try to save his friend. He climbed down to him, gave him some mild painkillers that he had, and then he attached his rope to Joe. Simon anchored himself in the snow and began lowering Joe down the mountain, using all 300 feet of his rope. When he would stop, Joe would anchor himself in the snow with his ice picks, and then Simon would climb down to Joe and repeat the process over and over again, lowering him 300 feet at a time. This went on for hours and hours of back-breaking work for Simon. Joe, meanwhile, was in excruciating pain from his broken leg. To make matters worse, the storm had gotten so bad that the visibility between them was zero. As Simon was lowering Joe, he could not see what he was lowering Joe onto. But they had no other choice. That was the only way they could get him down. At 5 o'clock that night, Simon accidentally lowered Joe over a cliff. As soon as Joe was hanging off the edge, all of his weight was on the rope, and suddenly the rope was flying out of Simon's hands. Simon managed to stop him from careening over the edge, but now Simon was the only thing holding Joe from tumbling to his death, and Simon was being slowly dragged down the mountain. He could not anchor himself in, and they were in the middle of this inhospitable environment in the middle of the night. A storm was raging, it was freezing cold, and they could not communicate with each other. They could not hear each other or see each other. Simon was just hoping that Joe would be able to grab onto something and take his weight off the rope, otherwise this was going to end badly for both of them. But unfortunately, the cliff was at an angle, so Joe was dangling in midair and could not touch the wall. He had nothing to grab onto, and he was just dangling in the air. As Simon tried to move the rope to signal to Joe to take his weight off the rope, Joe was trying to climb up the rope, but his hands were starting to get frostbitten. He was weak, he was in pain, and he could not do anything about it. For the next 2.5 hours, Simon was desperately trying to regain an anchor in the snow, but every second that went by, he was getting pulled farther and farther down the mountain. He could not see how close he was to the edge, but he knew he was getting close. Finally, at 7:30 that night, with no other option, Simon pulled out a knife and cut the rope. As soon as the rope was cut, Simon fell backward. He was safe, and nothing was pulling him off the cliff any longer. But he knew he had just sent Joe to his death. Except Joe did not die. When that rope was cut, he fell 150 feet and smashed into the ground, but what he hit was a thin sheet of ice that broke from his weight, and he fell another 80 feet into a massive ice crevasse. Joe was knocked unconscious from the fall, but when he woke up, he was laying on his side. He opened his eyes, freezing, looked around, and could not believe he was alive. He did not know where he was, as it was totally dark. He turned on his headlamp and realized he had fallen into an ice crevasse. He looked down and saw he was on a little ledge that was overlooking a much deeper fall. The crevasse seemed to go on infinitely into a black chasm, and he realized that had he fallen even a foot to the side, that is where he would have gone. It was a miracle he was alive. But now he was trapped in the middle of an ice crevasse 80 feet down. He could not go down, and he could not go up. At the time, Joe did not know if Simon had fallen off the cliff with him or if he had cut the rope, but the rope was still attached to his waist and it fed up and out of the crevasse. He grabbed it and pulled on it until it all came tumbling back down, and he saw it was frayed. Sure enough, Simon had cut the rope. Even though Joe was not mad at Simon for the decision he made, because he understood it was the right one, Joe still became very emotional when he saw this. He felt so completely alone, and he was so sad. For a little while, he just kind of freaked out, screaming and crying, not knowing what he was going to do. After that, he sat down, knowing he was not getting out of there, and that he was going to die a slow, horrible, painful death. Joe remembers reaching up and turning off his headlamp, which retrospectively he thought was kind of goofy because he was about to die inside of this crevasse and he was saving batteries. But with the light off, he sat on the ledge and heard all the sounds coming from inside the crevasse. It was this awful, grinding, moaning sound. He said it was so terrifying sitting in the darkness listening to that sound that he reached up and turned his light back on just for comfort. Back up on the mountain, Simon was devastated. He felt like he had just killed his friend, and even though he understood why he did it, it did not change the fact that he felt incredibly guilty. That night, he did not even move from his position. He dug a little snow cave, laid down, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning when he got up, he began moving his way down the mountain. He finally rounded the area where Joe had been hanging off that cliff, and he got a chance to look down and see where Joe might have wound up. To his horror, he saw this massive opening to a crevasse that seemed almost bottomless, confirming that Joe had definitely died. Nonetheless, Simon went down to the edge of the crevasse and yelled for Joe, screaming for him to call out if he was still alive. But he never heard anything back, and with a heavy heart, Simon turned around and started heading back to base camp. A little while after Simon had left, Joe finally woke up. He had been asleep when Simon was yelling down for him. Joe wakes up, realizes this was not a bad dream, and starts yelling for Simon, but after a while he realized Simon was not coming back. Simon thought he was dead already. At this point, Joe decides he needs to try to climb out of the crevasse, even with a broken leg. He gets his ice picks and starts making his way up the ice wall, but he cannot put any weight on his broken leg, and he keeps falling down. He realized he could not climb this wall, probably not even with two good legs. So Joe had two choices. He could wait on the ledge and hope to be rescued, but by his calculations, it was highly unlikely anyone would come. Or he could go down deeper into the crevasse, having no idea where it goes, hoping that somewhere down in that black void, there was an opening that led back out to the outside of the mountain. He made his choice. He screwed an anchor into the ice, put his rope through it, tested it, and looked down into the void one last time. He knew that as soon as he stepped off this ledge, he could not come back up. This was a one-way trip, and if he made it to the bottom of his rope and did not find a ledge or a tunnel, he would fall to his death. On purpose, he did not put a knot at the end of his rope, figuring either he would find a way out or he would not, but at least it would be quick. Down he went, about 80 feet into this pitch-black crevasse. He got to a point where the walls came together, and he was able to squeeze through. Once he got through that point, it was like the center of an hourglass, where below it, the space opened up. As soon as he pushed through, he could actually see the ground. He saw flat ground, and there was light shining on it, which meant there was a hole leading out to the mountain. He went all the way down, touched the bottom, and disconnected from his rope. He climbed his way up an incline to where the sun was coming in, which was a hole leading right back out onto the mountain. He crawled out, tumbled onto the snow, and remembered just laying on the mountain looking at the sun and laughing. He could not believe it. But after the initial relief wore off, he realized he was not out of the woods yet. He still needed to climb down the rest of the mountain, and after that, he had to navigate 5 miles back to base camp. Over several delirious, painful, and miserable days, he managed to crawl all the way back to base camp. He got there right as Simon was packing up the tent and getting ready to leave. Simon could not believe he was looking at Joe alive. He just endlessly swore, unable to speak, feeling like he was looking at a ghost. But after that initial shock, Simon just gave Joe a massive hug, and they both cried and held each other. Joe underwent 6 surgical operations to repair the damage to his leg, and doctors told him he would never climb again, but after 2 years of intense rehabilitation, he was not only walking fine, but he was mountain climbing again. As for Simon, he managed to leave the mountain without serious physical injury, but he carried an enormous sense of guilt. Joe consistently states in every interview that Simon made the right decision, and that he is not at fault. Joe wrote a book about the experience called Touching the Void, which sold millions of copies worldwide and was adapted into a major motion picture. Today, they have drifted apart over the years, but they still consider each other friends. These 3 stories, though taking place in completely different corners of the world, all share a profound and deeply moving truth. They remind us that within every human being, there is a powerful primal drive to survive that can overcome the most impossible circumstances. When Tommy Ashcraft was lost at sea, when Ricky McGee was buried alive in the desert, and when Joe Simpson was trapped in the freezing depths of a crevasse, they all faced moments of absolute despair. They had every reason to give up, to let go, and to accept their fate. But they chose to fight. They chose to take one more step, to make one more calculation, to crawl one more mile. And in doing so, they proved that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments of our lives, the human spirit has the capacity to find a way back to the light. Their journeys leave us with a haunting and beautiful reminder of just how precious and how incredibly resilient human life truly is. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Many scary movies are set in the woods for a good reason. Consider it. The woods are naturally scary at night. More specifically, most of those films take place in a cabin in the woods at night. Being in the deep woods at night as humans ticks many fear boxes. The isolation factor comes first. We're scared because you're far from society and help. Isolation makes us more vulnerable, so we avoid it. Naturally, it checks darkness, fear. Humans fear the dark because they don't know what's around them or looking at them. City lights don't help in the forest. You are in complete darkness due to light pollution cancellation. That something can easily hide in the forest is the third fear check. You don't know what's watching because of all the trees. At every turn, predators, animals, or even predatory humans could hide behind any trunk. Hollywood has made countless movies using the cabin in the woods trope of isolation and fear because it works. We fear it deeply. Today's cabin in the woods story begins like many others, but it's different. True story, I was terrified. As I read about what happened in this cabin in the woods, I tried to imagine what this young man would go through psychologically. My horrific cabin in the woods experience haunts me to this day. I could relate to this guy because I've been there and the details of this story are terrifying. Try to imagine his situation as you listen to today's story. Consider your response to this situation. A 17-year-old boy was devastated when his father died suddenly in 2010. The whole family was shaken by this loss. They were grieving a husband and father, but also because their daily lives revolved around each other. This close family did almost everything together. They spent weekends and vacations together and had a strong bond that kept them together through every challenge. A special bond existed between the boy and his father. They were best friends, not just father and son. His father loved the outdoors and spent years teaching him to fish, hunt, and navigate the wilderness. They had spent hours together discussing life and planning for the future. Father had big dreams for his son, who looked up to him above all else. My dad never missed a game, always offered advice, and made his family feel safe no matter what was going on. Tearful faces, handshakes, and whispers of sympathy filled the funeral. People kept telling the boy that his father was in a better place and that he needed to support his mother and younger siblings. Strength was harder to achieve. The boy stopped going to school sports practices, and his grades started to drop because he could not focus on anything other than his massive void. He sat in his room at night, staring at his father's old hunting boots and favorite fishing rods, wishing for one more conversation. When his father died unexpectedly, the boy felt like his world had collapsed. The silence in their home and grief were almost unbearable. One of their favorite family activities was spending time at their cabin. This cabin was near Mount Bachelor, Oregon. Snowboarders, skiers, and winter enthusiasts visit Mount Bachelor, a beautiful mountain. Years earlier, the family built this cabin there and spent a lot of time there in winter. The family would go up, sit by the fireplace, ski during the day, and enjoy being away from the world. It was their favorite getaway. They could escape school, work, and normal life and focus on family. The father worked hard to build and maintain the cabin, and his style was evident everywhere. He had hand-carved wooden shelves, photos of their fishing trips on the walls, and a cozy, warm atmosphere he worked hard to create. During winter trips, his father taught him how to chop firewood, build a nighttime fire, and respect the wilderness. He told him the forest was beautiful, but that nature did not care about you, so you had to be aware. The boy felt confident and capable in the woods because of those lessons. After the father died, the family had to settle his estate. Any family finds this difficult, but theirs was especially difficult because every possession, room, and memory brought back their loss. They discussed the cabin while deciding what to do with everything. This place that brought them so much joy and happiness felt hollow suddenly. I had many fond memories there, but now it reminded me of who was missing. They realized life without him would be different. The laughter, shared meals, and fireplace warmth felt like a past they could never return to. The mother realized that returning to the cabin would be too painful and that she could not handle being there without her husband. After much crying and discussion, they decided to sell the cabin because going back there as a family was too painful. It upset the 17-year-old boy to hear this decision. He was close to his father and had many fond memories of hunting, skiing, and snowboarding at that cabin. Long car rides up the mountain, early mornings drinking hot chocolate by the stove, and quiet walks through the snowy pine trees came to mind. He saw the cabin as more than property. It felt like his father was there, a physical connection to his memory. The boy asked his mother for a favor after she listed the cabin for sale. Before the cabin was sold to a stranger and permanently removed from their lives, he asked to spend some time alone there. He wanted to honor his father. He wanted one last chance to sit there, remember the good times, and say goodbye. Mom understood completely. She wanted her son closure because she saw his pain. She advised him to proceed. She told him he could stay at the cabin as long as he wanted, but when he returned, they would close the sale and the property would be gone forever. Before his death, his father left his car to him. Receiving his father's well-maintained car was bittersweet for the 17-year-old. The boy decided to drive his father's car to the mountain. He saw it as another way to connect with his father. He went to the grocery store and bought his favorite snacks, sodas, and drinks for a few days. He bought everything he needed to avoid leaving the cabin once he arrived. He piled everything into the car. His bags contained warm clothes, snowboarding gear, and a video game console. Most importantly, he brought Midnight, the family black dog. The boy thought having Midnight, a loyal, friendly dog who was close to his father, would make the quiet cabin feel less lonely. The plan was simple. They would relax at this remote Oregon cabin after he drove there with Midnight. He wanted to enjoy the space one last time and make one last good memory before the property was sold and they moved on. He was determined to have a good trip so he wouldn't remember the cabin negatively. After packing, he put Midnight in the passenger seat and drove up the mountain. While listening to his father's favorite music on the radio, he saw the familiar scenery as the city faded and Oregon's dense forest took over. The drive was long and quiet, and as he climbed higher into the mountains, the pine trees grew taller and denser, forming a dark, silent wall. He felt comforted and sad by his father's car's old leather seats and engine hum, which reminded him of their past trips. He parked the car in the small gravel driveway to the cabin and inhaled. Mount Bachelor's wilderness was wild and unforgiving despite its rugged beauty. The mountain was covered in dense Douglas fir, hemlock, and pine forests. Black bears, cougars, and elk roamed these forests. The boy drove up the mountain road, keeping an eye on the thick tree line because he knew a wild animal could appear from the brush at any time. The roadside snow was high, and as he drove up, he felt like he was entering a different world, far from modern safety. His father's car's old engine roared as it climbed steep, icy hills, and the heater struggled to keep the cabin warm in the cold mountain air. He felt vulnerable, but also excited, believing that the mountain's cold and silence would help him regain his strength. To understand what happens next, we must discuss the cabin's layout. It was a two-story mountainside building. The back half of the cabin had no windows except for one tiny narrow one because it was built against the steep mountain slope. Back of the house's first-floor bathroom had this tiny window. This design was practical for insulation and stability against the mountain, but it closed off the back of the house from the outside, creating a blind spot. Unless you were looking through that tiny bathroom window, you would not see someone approaching the cabin from the mountain behind it. However, the cabin front was lovely. Large windows lined both floors of its double-decker design. Second-floor windows looked out from the master bedroom loft. A wooden balcony jutted out a few feet from the master bedroom. Large glass windows next to the front door let you see into the living room and kitchen on the first floor. The back of the house was dark and closed off, but the front was open to the wilderness. The cabin was built in dense forest. Years ago, the family had to clear out many trees to build the cabin's foundation. However, they only cleared a small area in front of the house for a driveway and yard. The cabin was still surrounded by massive pine trees on all sides and back. This meant the cabin was in a tiny clearing surrounded by a dark forest wall. Looking out the window and over the balcony from the second-floor master bedroom, you could see the tree line about 100 yards away across this small clearing. The family left a few large trees in that clearing. A unique tree was here. A massive, heavy branch grew 20 feet above the ground, parallel to the ground. This thick, flat branch looked like a natural bench or seat, perfect for multiple people to sit. But it was 20 feet up and had no lower branches, making it difficult to climb. Nobody ever tried to climb the sitting tree, which stood in the middle of the clearing with its natural seat branch facing the cabin's front windows. After arriving at the cabin, the boy parked the car in the snowy driveway and turned off the engine. He sat contemplating the familiar wooden structure, feeling sad and comforted. Crisp, cold air, and absolute forest silence. He began unloading the car. He took his grocery bags from the trunk and brought them inside. He turned on the heater to warm the wooden rooms in the cold cabin. In the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator and put his sodas and drinks on the shelves. He arranged his snacks on the kitchen counter. He then carried his clothes and PlayStation up the wooden stairs to the second floor. He connected his video game console to the master bedroom loft's TV's back. Midnight was happily sniffing the house and wagging her tail downstairs. Her presence immediately warmed up the quiet cabin because she seemed to remember it. First 2 days of stay went as planned. Besides playing video games and eating snacks, the boy occasionally left the cabin to snowboard on Mount Bachelor. The slopes were great, the snow was fresh, and he felt peaceful in the mountains. Back at the cabin, he felt close to his father. He sat in his father's favorite chair, looked out the large front windows, and recalled his stories. Wood's silence was comforting, not lonely. He lost himself in his favorite PlayStation games to escape his months-long grief. In the quiet wooden cabin, the console hum and screen glow created a small world of normal life. He let Midnight sniff the snow and run around the clearing on long walks. This was a peaceful way to say goodbye to the place and wrap his father's memories in a positive ending. But on the third day, things got strange and unsettling. The third morning, the boy looked out the window. A massive snowstorm hit overnight. The driveway, clearing, and trees were covered in several feet of fresh snow, which was still falling in thick white blankets. After going downstairs, he saw his father's car completely buried out the front window. The driveway was white, and the hood was covered in snow. He looked at the heavy white flakes falling from the sky and decided not to shovel snow, clean the car, or drive down mountain roads. A storm like this could make mountain roads dangerous, so he didn't want to risk it. He thought staying inside all day would be safer and more fun. His lazy day with Midnight included snacking and playing video games. The third day snowstorm was a mountain blizzard. The massive pine trees around the cabin groaning and swayed as the wind howled. The snow was so thick that the front windows were completely covered in white. The cabin felt smaller and more isolated than ever, with no outside world exposure. Before turning on his console, the boy watched the fire die down to glowing embers in a heavy blanket all morning. He played a first-person shooter game, using the gunshots and action to drown out the forest silence. As the day went on, the storm intensified, and drafts of cold air whistling through the cabin's wooden walls made him feel like the wilderness was slowly entering. Midnight started pacing by the front door during the day to tell him she needed to use the bathroom. The boy donned his winter coat, boots, and unlocked the front door. He took Midnight out onto the front porch and let her run in the snow. He looked across the clearing's pure white ground from the porch, shivering in the cold. It was then he noticed something odd. Snow footprints were visible. They were clean and had unfilled edges from snowfall. The boy knew the footprints were not his because this was his first time outside all day. He wondered who made them. The nearest neighbors were miles away and elderly, so they rarely walked through the dense woods, especially in a snowstorm. To see better, the boy left the porch and approached the tracks. He saw that the footprints came from the thick tree line. They entered the clearing, curved around the cabin's front, and headed back to the steep mountain slope. He tracked them using the skills his father taught him on hunting trips. He noticed the footprints' long stride, suggesting the maker was tall. The snow impressions were deep and heavy, but the steps were spaced out carefully, as if the person had been moving quickly but carefully. He watched the tracks circle the cabin, noticing how close they were to the windows. The person approached the living room window glass, stood for a moment, and then headed back. The boy felt a subtle chill unrelated to the cold air. He followed the footprints up the steep slope behind the cabin, watching them disappear into the mountain's thick pine trees. Due to the steep slope, a normal person would have needed their hands to balance, but there were no handprints in the snow. It looked like this person walked up the steep mountain slope with ease. He tried to convince himself it was a local hunter or hiker who got lost in the storm. Bringing Midnight inside, he locked the door and forgot about the footprints. He played video games again, but a tiny seed of unease had been planted. He tried to focus on his game, but he kept looking at the windows, wondering if someone was watching the cabin from the trees. The boy played video games in the loft as afternoon turned to evening. Midnight slept peacefully on the rug beside his chair. The snow kept falling, burying the world in white silence. By 5, the forest was dark as the light faded early. The boy went downstairs to cook. After eating a simple meal at the counter, he decided to close the house for the night. He circled the first floor, drawing heavy blackout curtains over the large front windows. He closed all the blinds, double-checked that all first-floor windows were locked, and then went to the heavy front door. The deadbolt clicked as he turned it. After checking the cabin's security, he returned to the loft master bedroom. Midnight followed him into the large bed and settled near the head of the bed next to his pillow. After turning off the bedside lamp, the boy closed his eyes. He felt Midnight tense up after only a few minutes of lying in the dark. Though silent, the dog stood up and stood still on the mattress. This boy opened his eyes and looked at her. In the faint light from the second-floor window, he saw Midnight's ears perk up and her eyes focused on the wooden stairs to the first floor. It was like she heard something downstairs. The boy did not panic because Midnight was usually a calm dog, but she could be jumpy in new places. He petted her back to calm her and get her to lie down. Midnight ignored him. She jumped off the bed and ran down the stairs into the first-floor darkness. The boy sat up in bed, his heart racing some. He remained still, listening intently. Though the cabin was locked, he suddenly remembered the fresh footprints in the snow from earlier that day. He heard Midnight pacing downstairs on the hardwood floor. He heard her claws rapidly clicking against the wood from the front door to the windows and back. She made that sound when she was desperate to go outside. The boy lay there, growing uneasy. He didn't want to go downstairs in the dark, but he couldn't lie there while his dog ran around. He breathed deeply, got out of bed, and descended the stairs. After descending the stairs, he saw Midnight by the front door. She stared at the door crack with stiff body and forward-pointing ears. She whined silently, pleading for release. She probably needed to use the bathroom after drinking all that water, the boy thought. The deadbolt was unlocked and the door opened by his hand. Cold night air rushed into the warm cabin. Standing on the threshold, he expected Midnight to go out in the snow and do her business. But she didn't. Midnight slowly stepped onto the porch, head bowed. She stalked forward, her eyes fixed on the clearing's darkness. She stopped at the porch edge and stared at the sitting tree in the center of the clearing. Shivering in his t-shirt, the boy stood on the porch. He looked out into the darkness, but saw nothing. Only the massive, silent pine trees against the dark sky were visible. He whispered to Midnight to hurry to the bathroom so they could go back inside. The dog ignored him completely. She was frozen, her muscles tense, ready to run into the woods. The boy felt a chilling dread. The forest silence became heavy and hostile. He realized that whatever Midnight was looking at was out in the dark, and he didn't want his dog to chase it through the woods. He approached, grabbed Midnight by the collar, and pulled her toward the cabin. He pulled her in, locked the deadbolt, and closed the heavy wooden door. He looked through the door's small glass window one last time, but saw nothing but darkness. He quickly swept the first floor, checking every lock again to ensure security. He took Midnight and went upstairs. Midnight refused to return upstairs. The boy had to pull her up the stairs. The dog refused to get on the bed when they returned to the master bedroom. Instead, she stood at the loft edge, staring down the staircase, ears perked. She occasionally looked at the boy as if asking him why they were staying inside, then looked down the stairs. The boy retreated under the covers to calm his racing thoughts. He kept telling himself it was a deer or coyote that had wandered into the clearing. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. About 30 minutes passed silently. Just as the boy was falling asleep, a loud sound broke the silence. He heard a heavy, rhythmic thud above him. He froze, eyes wide. Sound came from the roof. The sound was loud and clear because the roof was directly above the master bedroom ceiling without an attic. He heard heavy footsteps on the wooden shingles. The sound was hollow, like animal hooves, according to the boy. About 6 steps were counted. Midnight immediately looked up at the ceiling, tracking the noise. Sitting up, the boy tried to think of a reason. He wondered how a deer or moose got on the cabin roof. The roof was steep and high. An animal couldn't have jumped onto it without a ladder or from one of the massive pine trees around the house. However, a tree jump would have made a loud, massive crash. He heard no crash. It seemed like whatever was up there had just appeared on the roof or had been there silently for a long time and just started walking. The roof footsteps stopped abruptly. Her head snapped down, and Midnight looked at the sliding glass door to the second-floor balcony. The door was closed, and the heavy blackout curtains were drawn to block the view. But Midnight stared at the glass like she knew something was there. Fear swept over the boy. Although he was a tough 17-year-old, being alone in the dark woods miles from help made him feel small. He avoided that balcony door. He wanted to hide under the covers and ignore everything, but he knew he couldn't wait in the dark for whatever it was to take action. He needed to know what was outside. He slid out of bed, shaking legs. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from the bedside table and held it tightly. Midnight walked beside him as he slowly approached the sliding glass door. He inhaled deeply and pulled back the blackout curtain. Outside was pitch black. He couldn't see through the glass. After opening the sliding door lock, he slowly pushed it open. Coming out onto the snowy balcony, the cold winter wind hit his face. Midnight nervously sniffed the air after him. His first thought was to look up. He pointed his flashlight at the roof above the balcony, expecting to see a deer, raccoon, or other animal trapped there. However, the roof was empty. He swept the light across the snowy shingles, but saw no animals or footprints from where he stood. He felt a little better. He wondered if the sound was snow sliding off the roof or his imagination. He then heard Midnight growling softly. She looked out into the dark clearing toward the sitting tree from the balcony edge, head pointing downward. The boy knew to check the yard. He raised his flashlight and swept it across the snow. He slowly moved the light from the house edge across the snow to the dense tree line. Light from the powerful beam illuminated the white ground through falling snow. He moved the light through the dark forest until it hit the sitting tree. A boy turned off the flashlight. He sat on the thick, parallel branch 20 feet above the ground. The boy froze, heart-stopping. His flashlight was focused on the tree figure. He was extremely tall and thin. His long arms gripped another branch above him as he crouched on the branch. Despite wearing dark, simple clothes, his face was exposed. He stared at the balcony boy with an unnaturally open mouth. He didn't blink. He stood still like a statue, holding onto the branches and staring at the 17-year-old with terrifying intensity. The sitting tree was less than 50 yards from the balcony, and the boy's flashlight highlighted every detail of the man's face. The boy's brain took a few seconds to process what he saw. A human, or something that looked like a human, was perched in a tree in a snowstorm, staring at him with a wide mouth. He felt the sight's terror physically. He panicked. His violent shaking caused him to drop the heavy flashlight. It clattered on the balcony's wooden floor. The noise made Midnight bark fiercely. The boy stood on the balcony in pitch-black darkness. Knowing the figure in the tree could see him, but not him, made him feel vulnerable. He desperately searched the balcony's snowy floor for the flashlight. Finally, his hand touched the cold metal. He grabbed it, turned it on, and instantly pointed the light at the sitting tree branch. Empty branch. The tall man left. The boy quickly swept the light down to the snowy ground beneath the tree, expecting to see someone running or hiding in the brush. There was nothing. The clearing was quiet, and the snow fell as usual. The boy acted immediately. He pushed Midnight back into the master bedroom by her collar and ran after her. He closed the sliding glass door, locked it, and closed the heavy blackout curtains to block the dark outside. He ran around the bedroom, turning off every light to make sure the cabin was dark so no one could see inside. After crawling back onto the bed, he pulled the blankets to his chest. Midnight crept up beside him, pressing against his side. She no longer growled or wanted outside. She shook, sensing the boy's terror. The boy lay in the pitch-black room, staring at the ceiling and losing control. He kept wondering if what he saw was real. How could a man sit on a 20-foot branch in a tree without lower branches? He got up there, quickly and quietly. How? Why was he crouched with his mouth open, staring at the cabin? The man's unblinking eyes and gaping mouth were etched in his mind. He recalled the roof footsteps he heard moments earlier. Was that the same man? If this person could climb a 20-foot tree effortlessly, he could climb the cabin roof. The boy checked his phone. Middle of the night. With a heavy heart, he realized he had several hours before sunrise. He was alone in miles of deep forest with no neighbors or way to get help. Someone or something stalked him from the darkness in the cabin. Room silence became agonizing. The boy tried to listen through his heavy breathing and heartbeat. After what seemed like an eternity, a sound broke the silence. The tapping was rhythmic and soft. Sound came from downstairs. The sound was like a fingernail gently tapping glass. Tap, tap, tap. Freezing, the boy held his breath. He and Midnight turned toward the stairs, listening to the first-floor noise. Although the boy knew all the downstairs doors and windows were locked, the tapping was very deliberate. A tree branch scraping the house or wind blowing against the wood were not the sounds. A steady, rhythmic tap on the front door glass. Panic hit the boy. He knew he wouldn't check downstairs. He lay still, praying that anyone outside would think the cabin was empty and leave. Front door tapping stopped after a few minutes. Long hours of tapping destroyed the boy's sense of time. Every second felt like an eternity, and the bedroom darkness seemed to close in on him. Under the heavy blankets, sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cold draft. He strains to hear the rhythmic tap, tap, tap that seemed to echo throughout the cabin. He counted the taps to find a pattern, but the sound was random. It started on one window, paused for a few minutes, and then started on another wall. It was deliberate, slow torture. He knew that running to his father's car in the pitch blackness would require running through deep snow, and the car was likely buried too deep to start or drive away. He was totally dependent on the outside world. He felt a primal fear that paralyzes you by locking up your muscles and keeping your breath in your throat. The boy breathed quietly, hoping the nightmare was over. He heard slow, heavy footsteps in the snow outside the cabin, walking along the side. A moment later, tapping resumed. It was on the cabin side wall this time. A solid tapping against the house's heavy wooden logs made it louder. The sound slowly moved along the wall, tapping, tapping, as if someone outside was walking around the perimeter, dragging their hand or finger along the wood. The boy watched the bedroom wall, knowing that only a few inches of wood and insulation separated him from the outside world. The tapping reached the cabin's back. The boy's heart stopped. He heard a clear, sharp tap on the tiny bathroom window. The first-floor bathroom window behind his bed was narrow and small. The back of the cabin was built into the mountainside, elevating the ground outside to almost level with the second floor. The tapping was now a few feet from the bedridden boy. Tap, tap, tap. The thin glass and close sound made the boy feel like the person was in the room with him. His body shook under the blankets as he closed his eyes. The bathroom window tapping stopped, but the snow footsteps did not. The boy heard snow crunch as the person crossed the cabin. New rhythmic tapping began on the opposite wall, slowly moving from the back to the front of the house. It was a slow, methodical cabin exterior search. The person tapped every wall, window, and entry point one by one. After tapping the large windows next to the kitchen, the cabin's front door was tapped again. The kid felt hunted. He realized this wasn't a random passerby. That person knew he was inside, and they were playing a sick, terrifying game with him, telling him they were out there, surrounding him, and he had nowhere to run. When the boy thought his nerves were shot, the downstairs tapping stopped. Silence for a few minutes. The boy had his muscles tense, waiting for the next sound in the dark. Then he heard heavy, slow footsteps on the second-floor balcony's wooden stairs. His heart sank into his stomach. The person climbed the balcony. A second later, the tapping began on the master bedroom's large sliding glass doors a few feet from his bed. Tap, tap, tap. The boy looked at the heavy blackout curtains, knowing that the tall man was on his belly looking at the dark room behind that thin layer of fabric and glass. Slowly tapping, the glass continued. The room was filled with a constant, annoying sound. The boy feared the man would break the glass or force the sliding door lock. He knew he had nowhere to run if the door opened. He clung to midnight, frozen in fear, waiting for the glass to break. Glass did not shatter. The sound stopped after several minutes of tapping on the balcony door. After hearing the wooden balcony creak as the weight shifted, the boy heard someone climbing onto the roof above him. Ceiling tapping began shortly after. It moved slowly across the roof above him. Tap, tap, tap. All night, the person paced the roof, tapping the wood. No sleep was had by the boy. He lay in the dark, listening to the rhythmic tapping above him and watching the room's shadows change as the hours passed. The longest night of his life. He felt powerless in an endless nightmare. After hours of psychological torture, the boy saw the first dawn light peeking through the blackout curtains. He was too scared to move after the roof tapping stopped. The boy got up from bed as the sun slowly rose over the mountains, casting a bright, cold light on the snowy landscape. His body was stiff and exhausted from nighttime tension. He slowly approached the sliding glass door and inhaled. He pulled back the blackout curtain edge. The balcony was empty. He blinked as the morning sun reflected off the white snow. He opened the sliding door slowly and stepped outside into the cold morning air. Midnight sniffed the ground as she followed him out. He looked down at the balcony floor first. Fresh snow from the night was covered in a mess of footprints. Someone appeared to have been pacing the balcony for hours. He walked to the balcony edge, turned around, and looked up at the cabin's steep roof. The roof was covered in footprints in the fresh snow. He saw a racetrack of tracks crossing the shingles above his bedroom. The boy then walked to the balcony's wooden railing to look down. Footprints covered the cabin clearing. He saw a dense circular path of tracks that circled the cabin, passing every window and wall where he had heard the nighttime tapping. They looked like heavy bare feet or thin-soled shoes packing the snow into a track. The boy watched the footprints. After seeing the path start at the cabin base, he followed the tracks across the clearing to the sitting tree. The footprints ended at the tree base. The boy imagined the tall man crouched in the dark on the thick parallel branch 20 feet above him. Another set of footprints left the tree base and disappeared into the dense forest and pine tree wall. The boy was adamant. He ran back inside the cabin, grabbed his clothes, video game console, and bags, and threw them in without folding. Cleanup and packing were unimportant to him. He wanted out as fast as possible. He grabbed Midnight, ran downstairs, unlocked the front door, and ran to his father's car. He put his bags in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and started the engine. He only cleared the windshield enough to see the road ahead, not all the snow. He put the car in reverse, backed down the snowy driveway, and left the cabin without looking back. He returned home, exhausted, pale, and shaking. His mother immediately noticed something was wrong. He cried on the couch as he told her everything that happened at the cabin. He described the footprints, roof footsteps, tall man in the sitting tree, and constant window and wall tapping. His tale horrified his mother. She saw her son's trauma in his eyes and knew he wouldn't lie. She called the Mount Bachelor Sheriff's Department immediately. The report was taken seriously, and a deputy investigated the cabin. After several hours, the deputy arrived at the property. The heavy snowstorm had turned into a light drizzle as the temperature rose. The fresh snow on the roof and balcony had melted and fallen off, destroying much of the evidence. The deputy found some packed snow around the cabin base and sitting tree, confirming that someone had been walking around the house, but the melting snow had erased the footprints. The deputy searched the vast forest for residents, but found none. During the investigation, the deputy asked the mother and boy if his late father had any enemies or if anyone was targeting the family. They couldn't name anyone. People liked his father, who had no enemies or business disputes. Another option was suggested by the deputy. Since the cabin was listed online, he said it was public. This allowed anyone with an internet connection to see the cabin's photos, isolated location, and likely empty interior. A drifter, squatter, or local predator may have seen the listing, realized the cabin was rarely occupied, and decided to use or scout it out. When the 17-year-old boy arrived alone, they may have played a terrifying psychological game with him. The boy felt queasy, thinking about someone watching him from the dark forest and planning their approach using a public real estate listing. The deputy searched local records after filing his report at the station. This was not the first time a Mount Bachelor cabin reported strange events. Locals reported several phantom tapper sightings over the past decade. These winter reports came from isolated cabins. Property owners reported hearing rhythmic tapping on their windows and walls at night, always accompanied by roof footsteps. Many owners found strange footprints in the snow the next morning, but the culprits were never found. Some older locals whispered about mountain drifters who lived in caves or makeshift shelters in the wilderness, completely disconnected from society. Other stories involved ancient forest spirits who didn't want humans on their land. Regardless, the police never caught anyone and the cases remained unsolved. Quickly after the incident, the family sold the cabin. After learning they would never own that property again, the 17-year-old boy was relieved. It changed him forever, and he never returned to Mount Bachelor. He was afraid of the dark for years afterward and couldn't sleep without checking his door and window locks. He often lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of his house, afraid of hearing that slow, rhythmic tapping on his bedroom window. He still doesn't know who or what stalked him that night. Was it a local who knew the family was selling the cabin and wanted to terrorize the occupants? A mentally unstable woods drifter? Or was it something more sinister and unexplainable? The image of the tall man on the branch with his mouth open and unblinking eyes will haunt him forever. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. A relaxed pace of life may be found in the little town of Osborne, Idaho, in the state of Idaho. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone else, and the routine of daily life is determined by the gentle rhythm of the changing of the seasons. A thick covering of immaculate white snow encompasses the area during the winter months, transforming the rocky hills and dense forests into a world that is silent and frozen during this time of year. Dylan Parker, who was 18 years old at the time, was negotiating the final stretch of his teenage years in this particular context. The majority of the time, Dylan was a typical child. He was in the process of determining what he wanted to do with his life after graduating from high school. He had a strong bond with his family, particularly with his mother, and he had a nice group of friends from his younger years. He, like many other adolescents, had pleasure in interacting with others, and on the evening of the 12th of January 2016, he found himself at a party with a few of his close companions for the first time. A home in his hometown was the location of the party that was being held. A continuous snowfall had been dusting the town for hours, adding to the already thick snowpack that was on the ground. It was a cold night during which the snowstorm had been occurring. At the interior, there was a friendly and energetic environment. Dylan was having a nice time, and there was music playing, people were talking and laughing, and things were going well. A couple drinks were consumed by him as the night progressed. As the hours went by, Dylan made the decision that it was almost time for him to leave the party and go home. This was not something that was out of the norm for a party like this. The effects of the alcohol were beginning to take hold of him, and the prospect of returning to the warmth and comfort of his own bed felt like a very good idea. It was the weather that was the issue. Considering that it was still snowing and that it was chilly, walking home was not a very good alternative. Therefore, he did what any other child in his position might have done. After pulling out his phone, he dialed his mother's number. As soon as his mother answered the phone, she was able to determine, without a doubt, that Dylan had been drinking. There was a slight slur in his voice, and his words were slurred. She felt the usual mixture of parental emotions, a little amount of disappointment, a touch of aggravation that he was drinking at a young age, but the thing that made her feel the most concerned was a profound sense of protectiveness over him. It was late, the weather was terrible, and all she truly needed was to know that her son was safe and sound while he was staying at home. It would be possible for them to discuss his decisions in the morning. Consequently, she listened attentively when he inquired about the possibility of her coming to pick him up. It was he who informed her that he was at a party and that he would stroll down the road to a gas station in the vicinity in order to meet her. It was a well-known location that was simple to locate. There was no uncertainty in her agreement. She informed him that she was on her way and that he should wait for her at the location she was going to be. Immediately following the conclusion of the call, Dylan's mother retrieved her keys and her coat before departing into the chilly night. As the snow continued to fall, the roads became difficult to navigate and visibility was somewhat diminished. While she was driving, she kept her mind focused on her son. Although she was imagining the lecture that she was going to deliver to him the next day, the primary objective at the moment was to just get him into the car and drive him back to the house. It was possible that she was only a few minutes away from the petrol station when her phone called once again as she was driving. Dylan was the one. On the other hand, the manner in which he spoke was entirely different this time. A comfortable and intoxicated slur was no longer present. She felt a bolt of alarm run through her body as a result of the sharp, anxious edge that had replaced it. Fear was audible in his voice. When he inquired, "Where are you?" "Where are you, Mom?" His voice was strained and frantic. "Where are you?" She attempted to reassure him that everything would be fine by assuring him that she was almost there, that she would be there in a minute or two, and that she was almost there. They were only a short distance away. However, the call was cut off suddenly. He just ended the call. It was 1 minute later when she pulled into the petrol station, which was illuminated by strong fluorescent lights. As she examined the surroundings, she anticipated seeing Dylan waiting for her, possibly stamping his feet to increase his body temperature. The snow was swirling around her car as she did so. However, he was not present. During the few minutes that she waited in the car, she entertained the thought that perhaps he was just walking down the road and was running a little bit behind schedule. However, the minutes continued to pass, and there was still no indication that he was present. She started to feel a knot of worry tightening up in her stomach. She attempted to call his phone, but the call was immediately transferred to his voicemail. That was a peculiar occurrence. Not long ago, he had called her. Why is his phone turned off at this moment? After getting out of her vehicle, she proceeded to stroll into the gas station. She inquired with the person working behind the counter as to whether or not they seen a young man who matched the description of her son. There was a head shake from the cashier. There had been no one else in the room like that. At this point, genuine fear was beginning to take hold. She got back into her vehicle and started driving around the neighborhood in the immediate vicinity. As she drove between the gas station and the house where the party had been held, she went up and down the road 3 times. She cried his name into the snowy night as she rolled down the window, allowing the chilly air to rush in. The night was silent around her. However, the only reaction that could be heard was the gentle hiss of the snow falling. "Dylan! Dylan!" Approximately 30 minutes passed while she was driving around, and her heart was beating rapidly with each passing moment. She continued to call his phone over and over again, but each and every time the call was disconnected and sent to his voicemail. The situation was not right. This was not typical of him. That frantic phone call kept playing over and over in her head. Something had transpired in his life during the brief interval of time that elapsed between the initial call he made to her and the subsequent call he made to her. She was absolutely confident that she required assistance, and the realization gave her a chill down to her bones. She halted her vehicle, her hands shaking, and then she dialed the number for the police. The data were taken down by the police from Dylan's mother, who was in a state of panic when they arrived. The young man, who was 18 years old, went to a party, had a few drinks, and then called for a ride, and now he is missing. In a circumstance such as this one, the first notion that comes to mind is frequently that the individual is not in any real danger. Perhaps he became disoriented as a result of the booze and made the decision to stroll to the residence of a different acquaintance. Perhaps his phone had a malfunction, and he had to find a place to rest for the night nonetheless. However, there was not an immediate feeling of a significant crisis, despite the fact that the police had informed his mother that they would seek for him. Once they arrived, their first destination was the residence where the party had been held. They entered the building and immediately began conversing with the children who were still present. Specifically, they inquired about Dylan. What was the most recent time that they visited him? What kind of temper did he have? Is he going to tell you where he is going? Every single one of the responses was similar. Everyone remarked that Dylan appeared to be in good health, His disposition was upbeat, and he was simply hanging out with the other people. Towards the end of the night, he merely stated that his mother was on her way to pick him up at the gas station. After that, he said his goodbyes and went out of the door. Nobody seen him getting into a car with anyone else. Nobody overheard any arguments, and nobody witnessed anything out of the ordinary. Just now, he left. According to their point of view, the evening came to a conclusion that was entirely typical. After expressing their gratitude, the law enforcement officers returned to the outdoors. The search of the area was initiated by them. The route that led from the party home to the gas station was investigated by them. Their flashlights were able to cut through the pouring snow as they searched in ditches and behind buildings. And still, they discovered nothing. There is no trace of Dylan. They did not find any discarded jackets or footprints that they could positively identify as belonging to him. While the hours went into days, the search for Dylan Parker became more and more intensified. As time went by, the initial hypothesis that he had simply wandered out and would return with a slight hangover began to lose its validity, and it was gradually replaced with a rising concern for his well-being. A bigger number of search parties were formed by the local police enforcement. Many others, including friends, relatives, and members of the community, came out to lend a hand, dressed in heavy clothing, to protect themselves from the bitter cold of the Idaho winter. Across the entirety of Osborne, they dispersed themselves and searched in fields, neighborhoods, and wooded regions. They concentrated on the path that he ought to have followed, which was from the party house to the gas station, and then expanded their search grid in a more general direction from there. However, the snow proved a significant hindrance. Because of the severe snowstorm that occurred on the night that he vanished, any possible trails or evidence had been covered up, and the environment remained frozen solid due to the cold temperatures. It was like trying to find a needle in a huge haystack that was completely white. The family of Dylan found themselves in a state of suspended pain for a period of 10 agonizing days. They jumped with excitement at every phone call, hoping that there was some kind of news. Every time someone knocked on the door, a new wave of anxiousness was triggered. The flyers for the missing person were distributed across the entire town, with the image of Dylan's happy smile appearing on community notice boards and telephone poles. The town of Osborne came together in support of them, but in spite of all the efforts that were made, there was unquestionably nothing. At that moment, it appeared as though Dylan Parker had simply disappeared into the chilly winter air. The police had no leads to follow. Even though they had investigated his phone records, the most recent action that had occurred was that frantic call to his mother. Immediately after that, the phone was either turned off or the battery died in some way. The digital trace could not be followed in any way. After 10 days had passed since Dylan had vanished, the investigation suddenly took a tragic and unexpected turn. Police officers or search teams were not the ones who made the find. It was a complete and utter coincidence. It was a desolate region outside of town where two people were out riding their all-terrain vehicles, ATVs. As they navigated the treacherous and icy terrain, they were having a good time when they experienced a collision. Although it was not a serious incident, they made the decision to leave their damaged ATVs there and come back for them in the morning. This was because it was late in the evening. They went back to the location the following day when the sun was shining brightly in order to return and reclaim their automobiles. And at that moment, they came across something that caused them to come to a complete and utter halt. There was a body that was lying in a dense stretch of forest high up on a hill, partially covered in snow. As soon as they could, they contacted the authorities. It was determined that Dylan Parker was the deceased individual when the police arrived and recognized the body. The worst concerns that his family had had just come true. As the initial wave of shock and grief went over everyone, however, the detectives who were present at the site started to discover that something was extremely, extremely wrong. The very location was the first significant warning sign that was raised. It was a long way from where anyone had been looking when Dylan was discovered. In order for him to arrive to this location, he would have needed to walk in the opposite direction of the petrol station where he was meant to meet his mother. The petrol station was located in the middle of the town, close to the roadways, the lights, and the heart of the community. Away from all of that was the location where he was discovered. It would have been necessary for him to walk uphill, away from the town, and into the woods where it would have been dark. In no way did it make any sense at all. The presence of alcohol in Dylan's system would eventually be confirmed by a toxicology study, despite the fact that he was actually in his hometown. He was so familiar with the region that he could walk into it. In spite of the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol, it seems highly improbable that he would become so bewildered that he would walk for kilometers in the wrong way, uphill, and into a tough environment that was covered in trees. By heading in the direction of the gas station, one was walking in the direction of civilization. There would have been a clear beacon in the form of the lights of the town. If you walked in the opposite direction, you would be entering a completely dark wilderness. There was a major disparity between the two routes. Why would he choose the path that would take him away from his ride home and away from the potential for danger? On the other hand, that was only the beginning of the peculiar and unsettling riddle that the detectives were currently looking into. In and of itself, the scene exhibited a number of physical inconsistencies that prevented any straightforward explanation from being possible. The snow was the component that was the most perplexing. The night that Dylan went missing, there was already a considerable amount of snow on the ground, and it continued to snow throughout the night. Dylan was in the process of going missing. There was no snowfall for the 10 days that followed, which was the time period until his body was discovered. The temperatures remained constantly below freezing, which meant that none of the snow that was already present had melted. This was an extremely important fact. A flawless and unaltered record of the ground was produced as a result of this. A clear set of tracks would have been left behind by any person or vehicle that moved through that region, and those tracks would have been preserved in the frozen snow. An exhaustive search of the entire area surrounding Dylan's body was carried out by the detectives after his body was reported missing. Footprints, tire marks, and any other indication of how he arrived were among the things that they were looking for. It was a complete failure. There were no traces that led to the body of the deceased. It was impossible to find any tracks that led away from the body. It was impossible to find any form of footsteps, not only his, but also those of anyone else. Neither an automobile nor an all-terrain vehicle left any tire tracks here. The snow that was all around him was unbroken and as smooth as silk. It appeared as though he had been meticulously positioned there from above, as if he had tumbled down from the heavens into that particular location. This revelation was the single most important factor in disproving the idea that he had strayed off and became disoriented. In the event that he had walked there, there would have been a lengthy and distinct path of his own footsteps flowing up the hill and into the woodland underneath. Neither of these trails existed. Without a doubt, it was physically impossible. Given this information, it was likely that he had been brought to that area by means of another method. If so, how? In this case, a vehicle would have left tracks. There would have been a clear path left behind, even by a snowmobile. In contrast, there was nothing. Simply by virtue of this circumstance, the investigation was transformed from a possible accident into a death that was subject to intense suspicion. As the detectives continued their search, the more peculiar these circumstances appeared. Dylan was discovered without his pants and without his boots, which was yet another piece of information that was really unsettling about the scene. However, his lower body was exposed to the elements, despite the fact that he was wearing a shirt and socks. The fact that hypothermia was stated as the official cause of death for the individual in question was a peculiar occurrence overall. Despite the fact that it is true that a person might experience a phenomena known as paradoxical undressing in the final stages of freezing to death, in which they begin to feel hot and begin to remove their garments, the fact that those clothes were completely absent from the scene was extremely suspicious. His pants and boots ought to have been laying right there next to him, or at least someplace in the immediate neighborhood, if he had removed them on his own while he was in a state of confusion. There was a thorough and extensive search of the region that was carried out. A grid was constructed by dozens of law enforcement authorities and search and rescue teams on the hillside and in the woodland surrounding the location where Dylan was discovered. They searched every inch of the area. A combination of metal detectors and K9 units that had been specifically trained to locate pieces of clothing and human scent were utilized by the team. They looked on for several days. His pants were never located by them. His boots were never located by them. All of the goods had simply vanished. The fact that he did not remove them himself at that location was strongly implied by this revelation. It suggested that they were removed and taken away from the scene by a different individual, maybe with the intention of removing any potential evidence that might have been present. The condition of Dylan's feet, on the other hand, was perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence that pointed away from the accident theory. Upon his discovery, he was only wearing socks. It would be necessary for a person to go through a difficult, snowy, and rocky forest in order to reach that remote location that is located high on a hill. If someone were to attempt that voyage without wearing boots, they would undoubtedly get multiple injuries. They would suffer cuts, scrapes, and bruises on their feet as a result of the pebbles and branches that were concealed behind the snow. This would result in their socks being ripped to shreds and covered in mud, snow, and grime. This is nothing more than basic physics and common sense. When the body of Dylan was investigated by the detectives, they were astounded to discover that his socks were spotless. There was no evidence of them being damp, unclean, or ripped. And when the feet were examined by the coroner, it was discovered that they were absolutely free of any injuries. Everything that would have indicated that he had traveled even a short distance over that kind of terrain was completely absent, including cuts, bruises, scratches, and other marks. As a result of this particular piece of information, the official story was entirely discredited. The task was not feasible. There is no way that he could have done that by foot. The absence of footprints in the snow that was completely untouched, the fact that his pants and boots were absent, and the fact that his feet and socks were clean and unharmed, all contributed to the creation of a disturbing picture. There was no evidence that Dylan Parker made his way into the woods and died of hypothermia. That is where he was brought. The circumstance had been fabricated. This somebody had either transported him or drove him to that spot via an unidentified method that did not leave any traces behind, removed some of his clothing, and then left his body there for others to discover there. The event in question was not a terrible accident, rather it was something much more diabolical. Behind the scenes, a huge disagreement started to develop as the official investigation moved forward toward its conclusion. The official cause of death was ruled to be hypothermia according to its finding. On the basis of this information, the local authorities and the county were getting ready to conclude the case and declare Dylan's death to be the result of an undesirable accident. The story that they were constructing was that he had been drinking, that he had become disoriented in the snowstorm, that he had strayed in the wrong direction, and that he had ultimately passed away due to the frigid conditions. Although they accepted the peculiar features, they appeared determined to disregard them as anomalies that might be explained, possibly due to the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol. Nevertheless, this straightforward explanation was not accepted by all individuals. An individual by the name of David Roos, who served as the deputy coroner, was one of the important figures who disagreed. Roos had been present at the location. After examining Dylan's body, he had left. In addition, he was the kind of person who put the utmost faith in reasoning and evidence. It was very clear to him that this was not anything that could have happened by chance. Among the anomalies that were not insignificant were the pristine snow that did not have any tracks, the missing clothing that were never located, and most importantly, the spotless socks and feet that were not wounded. They were evident inconsistencies with the theory that the disaster occurred. He was certain that Dylan had been the victim of some kind of criminal activity. He was under the impression that Dylan had been attacked or killed after leaving that party, and that his body had been transported sometime later to that hillside in order to deceive authorities. He suspected that something had occurred to Dylan after he left that party. His professional view was that the scene was a planned performance. David Roos became somewhat outspoken in his expression of his worries. His findings were reported to his superiors, and he urged that the case ought to be treated as a possible homicide. He also had conversations with the investigators who were leading the investigation. He was of the opinion that it would be a grave injustice to Dylan and his family to just assume that it was an accident. That whoever was genuinely responsible for his death would be able to get away with it was the implication of this. However, his arguments were not taken seriously by anyone. Those in charge of the local government were resolute in their conclusion. In a public announcement, they stated that Dylan Parker's death was the result of an accident and that there was no evidence to suggest that he was murdered. They were formally putting an end to the investigation. David Roos was utterly appalled by this decision. His impression was that the authorities were disregarding physical evidence that could not be refuted. Instead of letting it go, he made the decision to voice his concerns to the general public. In his statement to the media, he detailed the various contradictions that were present at the site and expressed his unwavering conviction that Dylan had been the victim of an assault. He anticipated that by drawing the attention of the public to the issue, he would be able to exert pressure on the county to restart the inquiry and take a serious look at the potential of homicide. In his defense of what he considered to be the truth, he was fighting. However, the response that he received from the county was not what he had hoped for. In lieu of conducting a fresh investigation into the matter, they focused their attention on him. David Roos was terminated from his post as deputy coroner by the county shortly after he made his disagreement with the current administration public. In their formal explanation, they stated that he was no longer qualified to perform the duties of the position. Roos, on the other hand, was persuaded that he was terminated for one purpose and one reason only: to keep him hidden from the public. He was under the impression that the county was trying to cover up the case in order to avoid the hassles and potential scandal that would arise from a homicide inquiry. He was a thorn in their side. Not only did they remove his official platform by sacking him, but they also made it abundantly apparent that they would not allow any type of opposition. Therefore, the official version of events was correct. It was determined that Dylan Parker's passing was by accident. This case has been resolved. However, there was never any more investigation carried out. Never once was anyone questioned about the likelihood of a criminal act being committed. It was never attempted to identify the person or individuals who were most likely responsible for Dylan's passing. Dylan's family was placed in an unfavorable circumstance as a result of the consequences of this decision. The pain that they were left with was compounded by a terrible sense of injustice, and they were completely unable to find any answers to their questions. They were given an official explanation for their son's death that was completely illogical and contradicted all of the evidence. They had a familiarity with both their son and the community. It was unfathomable to think that he would become so disoriented that he would walk in the opposite direction of his ride home, uphill into a dark forest, and that he would accomplish this without leaving a single footprint. Although it was terrifying to think about, the idea that was proposed by the coroner, David Roos, was the only one that appeared to be consistent with the peculiar and unsettling facts. The absence of traces, the absence of garments, and the pristine condition of his feet could all be accounted for by this one explanation alone. The question is, what exactly took place with Dylan Parker on that chilly night in January? We are able to attempt to rebuild a series of events that is more credible despite the fact that it is scary based on the data. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, Dylan left the party with the intention of walking the short distance to the petrol station. During the course of that little stroll, he came across something or someone. It was possible that it was a person he knew, but it could also have been a complete stranger. A ride might have been provided to him by them. When he called his mother for the first time, he was calm. Simply put, he was validating the action plan. However, within the few minutes that followed, a terrible occurrence occurred regarding the situation. The second phone call, the one in which he sounded terrified and worried, was most likely made while this horrific new circumstance was taking place. It's possible that he became aware that he was riding in a vehicle with a person who had no intention of driving him to the gas station. It's possible that a disagreement broke out. The last time anyone ever heard from him was when he committed suicide. What happened next is unknown, but it seems likely he was taken to a different, secondary location. He was either slain on purpose or restrained and left to expire as a result of exposure to the weather. Both of these events took place at that location. The people responsible then held onto his body for some period of time. After several days, perhaps when they felt the initial search efforts were dying down or moving to other areas, they decided to dispose of his body. They chose a remote location, a place where he was unlikely to be found quickly, but a place that might eventually be discovered. They transported his body up that hillside, possibly carrying him to avoid leaving footprints. They placed him carefully in the snow, removing his pants and boots before they left. Why they took those items is a mystery. Perhaps it was to remove any potential DNA evidence that might have been on them. Or maybe, in a more disturbing twist, they were taken as a kind of trophy. This reconstruction is the only one that accounts for all the impossible evidence found at the scene. It explains why there were no tracks in the snow. It explains why his feet and socks were clean. It explains why his pants and boots were missing and never found. But because the case was officially closed as an accident, this is all just theory. The troubling questions remain unanswered. Who did Dylan encounter after he left the party? What was said or done that led to that terrified phone call? And who would go to such elaborate lengths to stage a death scene to look like an accident, only to do it so poorly that it was full of impossible contradictions? For the family of Dylan Parker, these questions are a constant, haunting presence. They are left with the memory of their son and the knowledge that the truth of what happened to him was dismissed and buried along with him, leaving a cold case in the snows of Idaho that may never be solved. You are very much appreciated for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.